Section 39 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. Richard Hildreth, 1807 to 1865. One who begins to study Hildreth's History of the United States is alternately divided by feelings of impatience and admiration. The latter will predominate in the end, provided the student is not too impetuous. The reason care must be taken in assimilating Hildreth is that at times he becomes so intolerably dry that his reader is liable to desert him forever, before once discovering the excellences which have given him an assured place among American historians. Though Bancroft's history is more stimulating and more interesting to the general reader, Hildreth's has the advantage of covering a much longer period, all of which he treats exhaustively and with perfect accuracy in the presentation of facts. Moreover, he shows such voluminous and discriminating research, and in general so unbiased a judgment, that his achievement grows more valuable in its results as the years go by. The period which Hildreth covers so completely begins with the discovery of America, and ends with the close of President Monroe's first administration. The first 3 volumes bring us to the adoption of the Constitution. In his preface to these, he states that his object is to set forth the personages of our colonial and revolutionary history, such as they really were in their own day and generation, their faults as well as their virtues. He carries out this purpose, narrating events truthfully and candidly, and without trying to bend them to any theory. He treats of old colonial days in a somber sort of way, quite disheartening to the lover of picturesque anecdote and legend, and he appears to have imbibed to the full the prim and severe Puritan spirit of which he wrote. Life was a serious thing with the colonists of Massachusetts Bay, and Hildreth was guilty of no attempt to brighten their annals, or to turn any part of their records into a history of merrymaking. And thus, in those first 3 volumes, one looks utterly in vain for the picturesque or the amusing. The last 3 volumes, written several years later, which deal almost entirely with the growth of the Constitution and the political forces at work, are more vivid and at the same time much more valuable to the student. The facts are absolutely accurate, unless where new records have come to light since, and have been gathered with much care from the original public documents and state papers. He is on the whole wonderfully free from prejudice. His tone is one of calm and clear conviction, and produces the same attitude in the reader. His characterization of individuals is the best example. Few things of the kind have been better done. His criticism of men and motives is sometimes most scathing, yet his manner is so quiet and restrained that a full assent is instinctively given to his opinions, without the critical hesitation which a more vehement style would call forth. Nothing, for instance, could be further from the verdict which posterity has passed on John Quincy Adams than Hildreth's portrayal of him as a crafty and self-seeking political soldier of fortune. But Hildreth's judicial manner and tone of severe impartiality still produce much effect. Hildreth was a writer of some repute before his history appeared. born at Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1807, and educated at Harvard. He did a good deal of newspaper and editorial work in his younger days, and wrote papers on a variety of subjects. His work on Banks, Banking, and Paper Currency, published in 1837, is said to have had considerable influence in fostering the growth of the free banking system, and his other papers also attracted a gratifying attention. He was also the author of a tale called The Slave, or Memoir of Archie Moore, later renamed The White Slave, or Memoirs of a Fugitive, which has the distinction of being the first American anti-slavery novel published. His literary career, however, may be said to have closed with the appearance of his History. Appointed consul at Trieste, Italy, in 1861, he at once entered zealously upon his duties. His health failed, however, and he removed to Florence, where in 1865 he died. Richard Hildreth's name will be remembered chiefly from his History of the United States, and the solid and judicial qualities of that work will make it endure for many years to come. He will never be popular with the general reader, however. His narrative is too prosy, not vivid enough for a moment to enwrap the attention of the casual reader, and his occasional attempts at picturesqueness or descriptions of pageantry are very painful. The historian never arouses us with his enthusiasm, nor makes people and events live anew for us by the power of his inspiration. Nor is his writing in the least philosophical. Other historians make us see clearly the great sweeps and curves of the nation in its onward march, and they point out how its various trendings have led hither and thither. But Hildreth leaves us to trace out for ourselves the great highway, while he stops to explore some undiscovered and overgrown bypath, bestowing upon it the same painstaking research that he gives to conspicuous and important events. Yet, in spite of all these negatives, Hildreth will always, and rightly, command attention and admiration. His work is full of purpose, and has in it the energy of a forceful and zealous student. It is direct, untrammeled, and courageous. If it grows dull for the casual reader, it is a delight to the close student. The primitive historical instinct in its most finished state filled him, for in spite of its surface faults, his narration, in straightforwardness, accuracy, and firmness, is an admirable work of high and solid merit. Selection: Customs of the Colonists, from the History of the United States, by Richard Hildreth. According to the system established in Massachusetts, the church and state were most intimately blended. The magistrates and general court, aided by the advice of the elders, claimed and exercised a supreme control in spiritual as well as temporal matters, while even in matters purely temporal, the elders were consulted on all important questions. The support of the elders, the first thing considered in the first court of assistants held in Massachusetts, had been secured by a vote to build houses for them, and to provide them a maintenance at the public expense. This burden, indeed, was spontaneously assumed by such of the plantations as had ministers. In some towns a tax was levied, in others a contribution was taken up every Sunday, called voluntary, but hardly so in fact, since every person was expected to contribute according to his means. This method of contribution, in use at Plymouth, was adopted also at Boston, but in most of the other towns the taxing system obtained preference, and subsequently was established by law. Besides the Sunday services, protracted to a great length, there were frequent lectures on weekdays, an excess of devotion unreasonable in an infant colony, and threatening the interruption of necessary labor. So much so, that the magistrates presently found themselves obliged to interfere by restricting them to one a week in each town. These lectures, which people went from town to attend, an annual fast in the spring corresponding to Lent, and a Thanksgiving at the end of autumn to supersede Christmas, stood in place of all the holidays of the papal and English churches, which the colonists soon came to regard as no better than idolatrous, and any disposition to observe them, even the eating of mince pies on Christmas Day, as superstitious and wicked. In contempt of the usage of those churches, marriage was declared no sacrament, but a mere civil contract, to be sanctioned not by a minister, but a magistrate. The magistrates also early assumed the power of granting divorces, not for adultery only, but in such other cases as they saw fit. Baptism, instead of being dispensed to all, as in the churches of Rome and England, was limited as a special privilege to church members and their infant seed. Participation in the sacrament of the supper was guarded with still greater jealousy, none but full church members being allowed to partake of it. Besides these religious distinctions, there were others of a temporal character, transferred from that system of semi-feudal English society in which the colonists had been born and bred. A discrimination between gentlemen and those of inferior condition was carefully kept up. Only gentlemen were entitled to the prefix of Mr. Their number was quite small, and deprivation of the right to be so addressed was inflicted as a punishment. Goodman, or good woman, by contraction goody, was the address of inferior persons. Besides the indented servants sent out by the company, the wealthier colonists brought others with them. But these servants seem in general to have had little sympathy with the austere manners and opinions of their masters, and their frequent transgressions of Puritan decorum gave the magistrates no little trouble. The system of manners which the founders of Massachusetts labored to establish and maintain was indeed exceedingly rigorous and austere. All amusements were proscribed. All gaiety seemed to be regarded as a sin. It was attempted to make the colony, as it were, a convent of Puritan devotees, except in the allowance of marriage and money-making, subjected to all the rules of the stricter monastic orders. Morton of Merrymount, who had returned again to New England, was seized and sent back, his goods confiscated, and his house burned, as the magistrate alleged, to satisfy the Indians. But this, according to Morton, was a mere pretext. A similar fate happened to Sir Christopher Gardiner, a knight, or pretended knight, of the Holy Sepulchre, an ambiguous character, attended by a young damsel and 2 or 3 servants. Suspected as the agent of some persons who claimed a prior right to some parts of Massachusetts Bay, he was charged with having 2 wives in England, and with being a secret papist. He fled to the woods, but was delivered up by the Indians and sent home, as were several others whom the magistrates pronounced unfit to inhabit there. Walford the Smith, the old settler at Charlestown, banished for contempt of authority, retired to Piscataqua, which soon became a common asylum of refugees from Massachusetts. The sociable and jolly disposition of Maverick, described by Jocelyn, an early traveler, as the only hospitable man in the colony, gave the magistrates an abundance of trouble, and subjected Maverick himself to frequent fines and admonitions. Others who slandered the government or churches, or wrote home discouraging letters, were whipped, cropped of their ears, and banished. Selection: The Capture of André, from The History of the United States, by Richard Hildreth. During Washington's absence at Hartford, for his interview with Rochambeau in September 1780, a plot came to light for betraying the important fortress of West Point and the other posts of the Highlands into the hands of the enemy, the traitor being no other than Arnold, the most brilliant officer and one of the most honored in the American army. The qualities of a brilliant soldier are unfortunately often quite distinct from those of a virtuous man and a good citizen. Arnold's arrogant, overbearing, reckless spirit, his disregard of the rights of others, and his doubtful integrity had made him many enemies. But his desperate valor at Bamus's Heights, covering up all his blemishes, had restored him to the rank in the army which he coveted. Placed in command at Philadelphia, his disposition to favor the disaffected of that city had involved him, as has been mentioned already, in disputes with Governor Reed and the Pennsylvania Council. Arnold's vanity and love of display overwhelmed him with debts. He had taken the best house in the city, that formerly occupied by Governor Penn. He lived in a style of extravagance far beyond his means, and he endeavored to sustain it by entering into privateering and mercantile speculations, most of which proved unsuccessful. He was even accused of perverting his military authority to purposes of private gain. The complaints on this point made to Congress by the authorities of Pennsylvania had been at first unheeded, but being presently brought forward in a solemn manner, and with some appearance of offended dignity on the part of the Pennsylvania Council, an interview took place between a committee of that body and a committee of Congress, which had resulted in Arnold's trial by a court-martial. Though acquitted of the more serious charges, on 2 points he had been found guilty, and had been sentenced to be reprimanded by the commander-in-chief. Arnold claimed against the United States a large balance, growing out of the unsettled accounts of his Canada expedition. This claim was greatly cut down by the Treasury officers, and when Arnold appealed to Congress, a committee reported that more had been allowed him than was actually due. Mortified and soured, and complaining of public ingratitude, Arnold attempted, but without success, to get a loan from the French minister. Some months before, he had opened a correspondence with Sir Henry Clinton under a feigned name, carried on through Major André, Adjutant-General of the British Army. Having at length made himself known to his correspondents, to give importance to his treachery, he solicited and obtained from Washington, who had every confidence in him, the command in the Highlands, with the very view of betraying that important position into the hands of the enemy. To arrange the terms of the bargain, an interview was necessary with some confidential British agent, and André, though not without reluctance, finally volunteered for that purpose. Several previous attempts having failed, the British sloop of war Vulture, with André on board, ascended the Hudson as far as the mouth of Croton River, some miles below King's Ferry. Information being sent to Arnold under a flag, the evening after Washington left West Point for Hartford, he dispatched a boat to the Vulture, which took André on shore for an interview on the west side of the river, just below the American lines. Morning appeared before the arrangements for the betrayal of the fortress could be definitely completed, and André was reluctantly persuaded to come within the American lines, and to remain till the next night at the house of one Smith, a dupe or tool of Arnold's, the same who had been employed to bring André from the ship. For some reason not very clearly explained, Smith declined to convey André back to the Vulture, which had attracted the attention of the American gunners, and in consequence of a piece of artillery brought to bear upon her had changed her position, though she had afterward returned to her former anchorage. Driven thus to the necessity of returning by land, André laid aside his uniform, assumed a citizen's dress, and with a pass from Arnold in the name of John Anderson, a name which André had often used in their previous correspondence, he set off toward sunset on horseback, with Smith for a guide. They crossed King's Ferry, passed all the American guards in safety, and spent the night near Crom Pond with an acquaintance of Smith's. The next morning, having passed Pine's Bridge across Croton River, Smith left André to pursue his way alone. The road led through a district extending some 30 miles above the island of New York, not included in the lines of either army, and thence known as the neutral ground, a populous and fertile region, but very much infested by bands of plunderers called cowboys and skinners. The cowboys lived within the British lines, and stole or bought cattle for the supply of the British army. The rendezvous of the skinners was within the American lines. They professed to be great patriots, making it their ostensible business to plunder those who refused to take the oath of allegiance to the state of New York. But they were ready in fact to rob anybody, and the cattle thus obtained were often sold to the cowboys in exchange for dry goods brought from New York. By a state law, all cattle driven toward the city were lawful plunder when beyond a certain line, and a general authority was given to anybody to arrest suspicious travelers. The road to Tarrytown, on which André was traveling, was watched that morning by a small party on the lookout for cattle or travelers, and just as André approached the village, while passing a small brook, a man sprang from among the bushes and seized the bridle of his horse. He was immediately joined by 2 others, and André, in the confusion of the moment, deceived by the answers of his captors, who professed to belong to the lower or British party, instead of producing his pass, avowed himself a British officer, on business of the highest importance. Discovering his mistake, he offered his watch, his purse, anything they might name, if they would suffer him to proceed. His offers were rejected. He was searched, suspicious papers were found in his stockings, and he was carried before Colonel Jameson, the commanding officer on the lines. Jameson recognized in the papers, which contained a full description of West Point and a return of the forces, the handwriting of Arnold, but unable to realize that his commanding officer was a traitor, while he forwarded the papers by express to Washington at Hartford, he directed the prisoner to be sent to Arnold, with a letter mentioning his assumed name, his pass, the circumstances of his arrest, and that papers of a very suspicious character had been found on his person. Major Talmadge, the second in command, had been absent while this was doing. Informed of it on his return, with much difficulty he procured the recall of the prisoner, but Jameson persisted in sending forward the letter to Arnold. Washington, then on his return from Hartford, missed the express with the documents. His aides de camp, who preceded him, were breakfasting at Arnold's house when Jameson's letter arrived. Pretending an immediate call to visit one of the forts on the opposite side of the river, Arnold rose from table, called his wife upstairs, left her in a fainting fit, mounted a horse which stood saddled at the door, rode to the riverside, threw himself into his barge, passed the forts, waving a handkerchief by way of flag, and ordered his boatmen to row for the Vulture. Safe on board, he wrote a letter to Washington, asking protection for his wife, whom he declared ignorant and innocent of what he had done. Informed of Arnold's safety, and perceiving that no hope of escape existed, André, in a letter to Washington, avowed his name and true character. A board of officers was constituted to consider his case, of which Greene was president, and Lafayette and Steuben were members. Though cautioned to say nothing to criminate himself, André frankly told the whole story, declaring, however, that he had been induced to enter the American lines, contrary to his intention, and by the misrepresentations of Arnold. Upon his own statements, without examining a single witness, the board pronounced him a spy, and as such doomed him to speedy death. Clinton, who loved André, made every effort to save him. As a last resource, Arnold wrote to Washington, stating his view of the matter, threatening retaliation, and referring particularly to the case of Gadsden and the other South Carolina prisoners at St. Augustine. The manly and open behavior of André, and his highly amiable private character, created no little sympathy in his behalf, but martial policy was thought to demand his execution. He was even denied his last request to be shot instead of hanged. Though in strict accordance with the laws of war, André's execution was denounced in England as inexorable and cruel. It certainly tended to aggravate feelings already sufficiently bitter on both sides. Selection: James Madison, from The History of the United States, by Richard Hildreth. So far as Madison was concerned, had the majority for Calhoun's Internal Improvements Bill been more decided and more Southern, his scruples might perhaps have been less. The political character of the retiring president sprang naturally enough from his intellectual temperament and his personal and party relations. Phlegmatic in his constitution, moderate in all his feelings and passions, he possessed remarkable acuteness, and an ingenuity sufficient to invest with the most persuasive plausibility whichever side of a question he espoused. But he wanted the decision, the energy, the commanding firmness necessary in a leader. More a rhetorician than a ruler, he was made only for second places, and therefore never was but second, even when he seemed to be first. A Federalist from natural largeness of views, he became a Jeffersonian Republican, because that became the predominating policy of Virginia. A peace man in his heart and judgment, he became a war man to secure his re-election to the presidency, and because that seemed to be the prevailing bias of the Republican party. Having been, in the course of a long career, on both sides of almost every political question, he made friends among all parties, anxious to avail themselves whenever they could of his able support, escaping thereby much of that searching criticism so freely applied, with the unmitigated severity of party hatred, to his more decided and consistent compatriots and rivals. Those ultra-federal Democrats who rose, by his compliance, upon the ruins of the old Republican party, subscription to and applause of whose headlong haste in plunging the country into the war with England became for so many years the absolute test of political orthodoxy, found it their policy to drop a pious veil over the convenient weaknesses of a man who, in consenting against his own better judgment to become in their hands a firebrand of war, was guilty of the greatest political wrong and crime which it is possible for the head of a nation to commit. Could they even fail to load with applauses one whose federalism served as an excuse for theirs? Let us, however, do Madison the justice to add that as he was among the first, so he was, all things considered, by far the ablest and most amiable of that large class of our national statesmen, become of late almost the only class, who, instead of devotion to the carrying out of any favorite ideas or measures of their own, put up their talents, like mercenary lawyers, as too many of them are, to be sold to the highest bidder, espousing on every question that side which for the moment seems to offer the surest road to applause and promotion. End of section 39.
Section 40 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. Selected excerpts by Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679. Thomas Hobbes, whose name in the history of English philosophy is a large one, was the son of a Wiltshire vicar, and was born April 5th, 1588. His mother, who was of yeoman stock, gave birth to him prematurely, upon hearing the news of the Spanish Armada. The father is represented as a man of violent temper and small education. Hobbes began his schooling at the age of 4, and when 6 was engaged with Greek and Latin, translating Euripides into Latin iambics before he was 14, and showing himself to be a youth of unusual thoughtfulness. The schools at Malmesbury and Westport gave him his preliminary training, and in 1602 or 1603 he entered Magdalen Hall, Oxford. At this time the old scholastic methods obtained, and disputes between churchmen and Puritans were rife. This state of things was distasteful to the young Hobbes, and he neglected his studies and read in a desultory fashion. He took his degree in 1607. After his college days, Hobbes became tutor to the eldest son of William Cavendish, later Earl of Devonshire, and was attached to this family for many years, teaching the Cavendishes, father and son, traveling with them abroad, and being pensioned by them in his old age. This life brought him into contact with people of gifts and station, both in England and on the continent, and gradually Hobbes, by study and conversation with leaders of thought, developed his theory of psychology and of the state. He lived for years at a time in Paris, when he feared to remain in his own land because of the hostility excited by his works on Human Nature and De Corpore Politico. In 1661, at the age of 73, he returned to England and made his headquarters at the Cavendishes' town and country houses, rounding out his philosophical system and enjoying the friendship of such men as Selden of Table Talk fame and Harvey the scholar. Always a controversialist, seldom free from an intellectual quarrel with members of the Royal Society, his last days were no exception, and he no doubt wasted much time, better spent upon his main philosophical treatises, in bickerings about mathematics and other abstruse matters, keeping this up until his death at the rare old age of 91. He died December 4th, 1679, at Hardwicke Hall. Hobbes maintained his intellectual and physical powers to the very end. His health was poor in his youth, but improved in middle life. He wrote his autobiography at 84, and when 86 translated Homer. In person he is described as over 6 feet in height, erect, keen-eyed, with black hair. He had a contempt for physicians, was regular in his dietary and other habits, used tobacco, and states gravely that during his long life he calculated he had been drunk 100 times. After he was 60 he took no wine. At 75 he played tennis. Intellectually audacious, he had personal timidity. Charges of time-serving made against him have not been substantiated, however, as even so harsh a critic as Cunningham confesses. That Hobbes was a man of marked social attraction can be inferred easily. His friendships with Descartes, Bacon, Lord Herbert, Ben Jonson, and many other typical great men of his day indicate it, and there was much in his experience to develop that side of his character. Hobbes's fame as thinker and writer rests solidly on 2 great works, Human Nature, or The Fundamental Principles of Policy Concerning the Faculties and Passions of the Human Soul, 1650, and Leviathan, or The Matter, Form, and Power of a Commonwealth Ecclesiastical and Civil, 1651. The former states his philosophical, the latter his political views. In the Human Nature, his materialistic conception of the origin of man's faculties is developed. He regarded matter in motion as an ultimate fact, and upon it built up his psychology, deriving all the higher faculties from the senses. "There is no conception in a man's mind," said he, "which hath not at first, totally or by parts, been begotten upon the organ of sense." And he assumed selfishness as the motor power of human conduct, and made his explanation of right and wrong to rest upon purely utilitarian reasons. The modernness of this position may be seen at a glance. It anticipates 19th century psychology and the tenets of a Spencer. In one passage where he speaks of the incomprehensibility of God to a human faculty, latter-day agnosticism is foreshadowed. In the Leviathan, we get his equally radical views of the state. He conceives that in a state of nature men war upon each other without restraint. For mutual benefit and protection in the pursuit of their own interests, the social compact is made, and the powers of rule relegated to someone best fitted to exercise it. That someone, in Hobbes's opinion, should be and is the king as an embodiment of the state. Hence he preaches an absolute monarchy as the ideal form of government, the Leviathan of the human deep. And he would have ecclesiastical as well as other authorities subservient to the state. Very briefly stated, these are the cardinal points of his 2 great works. Of course, Hobbes's theories were bitterly assailed. Because of his ethics he was dubbed atheist, and his opponents included thinkers like Clarendon, Cudworth, Henry More, and Samuel Clarke. He was one of the best hated men of his time. His teaching in the Leviathan naturally brought the clergy about his ears, and the work was burned at Oxford after his death. But his principles made much stir, especially abroad, and looking back upon Hobbes from the present vantage point, it is plain that he is part of the great movement for thought expansion in which Bacon, Galileo, Kepler, Harvey, and Descartes are other parts. Locke probably was little influenced by Hobbes, but the Dutch Spinoza and the German Leibniz were, and in France Diderot, Rousseau, and de Maistre felt his thought. Comparing his 2 main works, Hobbes is most satisfactory in his political philosophy. His psychology is deduced rather than established by the Baconian method of induction, and his reading was not wide enough for such an inquiry. As an explanation of man, his philosophy is too fragmentary and too subjective, though brilliant, original, often logical. But the Leviathan is a complete exposition from certain premises, and a wonderful example of philosophic thinking. Moreover, it is by far the most attractive of his writings as literature. Its style is terse, weighty, at times scintillating with sarcastic humor, again impressive with stately eloquence. Among works in its field it is remarkable for these qualities. Hobbes's style, says Cunningham, who abhorred the other's views, is perhaps the finest model of philosophical composition, and the praise hardly seems excessive. Thomas Hobbes overthrew scholasticism, showed the error in the argument for innate ideas, prepared the way for Locke. He was a pioneer of thought in the 17th century, a liberalizing influence, however much it is necessary to modify his notions concerning human nature and the state. The standard edition of his works is that by Sir William Molesworth, 1839–45, in 16 volumes, 5 of them in Latin. Of Love, from Human Nature. Love, by which is understood the joy man taketh in the fruition of any present good, hath been already spoken of in the first section, chapter 7, under which is contained the love men bear to one another or pleasure they take in one another's company, and by which nature men are said to be sociable. But there is another kind of love which the Greeks call eros, and is that which we mean when we say that a man is in love. Forasmuch as this passion cannot be without diversity of sex, it cannot be denied but that it participateth of that indefinite love mentioned in the former section. But there is a great difference betwixt the desire of a man indefinite and the same desire limited ad hoc. And this is that love which is the great theme of poets, but notwithstanding their praises, it must be defined by the word need. For it is a conception a man hath of his need of that one person desired. The cause of this passion is not always nor for the most part beauty, or other quality in the beloved, unless there be withal hope in the person that loveth, which may be gathered from this, that in great difference of persons the greater have often fallen in love with the meaner, but not contrary. And from hence it is that for the most part they have much better fortune in love whose hopes are built on something in their person than those that trust to their expressions and service, and they that care less than they that care more, which not perceiving, many men cast away their services as one arrow after another, till in the end, together with their hopes, they lose their wits. Certain qualities in men, from Leviathan. Having showed in the precedent chapters that sense proceedeth from the action of external objects upon the brain, or some internal substance of the head, and that the passions proceed from the alterations there made and continued to the heart, it is consequent in the next place, seeing the diversity of degrees of knowledge in diverse men to be greater than may be ascribed to the diverse tempers of their brain, to declare what other causes may produce such odds and excess of capacity as we daily observe in one man above another. As for that difference which ariseth from sickness and such accidental distempers, I omit the same, as impertinent to this place, and consider it only in such as have their health and organs well disposed. If the difference were in the natural temper of the brain, I can imagine no reason why the same should not appear first and most of all in the senses, which being equal both in the wise and less wise, infer an equal temper in the common organ, namely the brain, of all the senses. But we see by experience that joy and grief proceed not in all men from the same causes, and that men differ very much in the constitution of the body, whereby that which helpeth and furthereth vital constitution in one, and is therefore delightful, hindereth it and crosseth it in another, and therefore causeth grief. The difference therefore of wits hath its original from the different passions, and from the ends to which the appetite leadeth them. And first, those men whose ends are sensual delight, and generally are addicted to ease, food, honorations, and exonerations of the body, must needs be the less thereby delighted with those imaginations that conduce not to those ends, such as are imaginations of honor and glory, which, as I have said before, have respect to the future. For sensuality consisteth in the pleasure of the senses, which please only for the present, and take away the inclination to observe such things as conduce to honor, and consequently maketh men less curious and less ambitious, whereby they less consider the way either to knowledge or other power. In which too consisteth all the excellency of power cognitive. And this is it which men call dullness, and proceedeth from the appetite of sensual or bodily delight. And it may well be conjectured that such passion hath its beginning from a grossness and difficulty of the motion of the spirit about the heart. The contrary hereunto is that quick ranging of mind described in chapter 4, section 3, which is joined with curiosity of comparing the things that come into the mind one with another. In which comparison a man delighteth himself either with finding unexpected similitude of things otherwise much unlike, in which men place the excellency of fancy, and from whence proceed those grateful similes, metaphors, and other tropes, by which both poets and orators have it in their power to make things please and displease, and show well or ill to others as they like themselves, or else in discerning suddenly dissimilitude in things that otherwise appear the same. And this virtue of the mind is that by which men attain to exact and perfect knowledge, and the pleasure thereof consisteth in continual instruction, and in distinction of places, persons, and seasons, and is commonly termed by the name of judgment. For to judge is nothing else but to distinguish or discern, and both fancy and judgment are commonly comprehended under the name of wit, which seemeth to be a tenuity and agility of spirits, contrary to that restiness of the spirits supposed in those that are dull. There is another defect of the mind, which men call levity, which betrayeth also mobility in the spirits, but in excess. An example whereof is in them that in the midst of any serious discourse have their minds diverted to every little jest or witty observation, which maketh them depart from their discourse by a parenthesis, and from that parenthesis by another, till at length they either lose themselves, or make their narration like a dream, or some studied nonsense. The passion from whence this proceedeth is curiosity, but with too much equality and indifference. For when all things make equal impression and delight, they equally throng to be expressed. The virtue opposite to this defect is gravity, or steadiness, in which the end being the great and master delight, directeth and keepeth in the way thereto all other thoughts. The extremity of dullness is that natural folly which may be called stolidity, but the extreme of levity, though it be natural folly distinct from the other, and obvious to every man's observation, I know not how to call it. There is a fault of the mind called by the Greeks amatia, which is indocibility, or difficulty in being taught, the which must needs arise from a false opinion that they know already the truth of what is called in question. For certainly men are not otherwise so unequal in capacity, as the evidence is unequal between what is taught by the mathematicians, and what is commonly discoursed of in other books. And therefore if the minds of men were all of white paper, they would almost equally be disposed to acknowledge whatsoever should be in right method and by right ratiocination delivered to them. But when men have once acquiesced in untrue opinions, and registered them as authentical records in their minds, it is no less impossible to speak intelligibly to such men than to write legibly upon a paper already scribbled over. The immediate cause, therefore, of indocibility is prejudice, and of prejudice, false opinion of our own knowledge. Another and a principal defect of the mind is that which men call madness, which appeareth to be nothing else but some imagination of some such predominancy above the rest, that we have no passion but from it. And this conception is nothing else but excessive vainglory or vain dejection, which is most probable by these examples following, which proceed in appearance every one of them from pride or some dejection of mind. As first, we have had the example of one that preached in Cheapside from a cart there, instead of a pulpit, that he himself was Christ, which was spiritual pride or madness. We have had also diverse examples of learned madness, in which men have manifestly been distracted upon any occasion that hath put them in remembrance of their own ability. Amongst the learned men may be remembered, I think also, those that determine of the time of the world's end, and other such the points of prophecy. And the gallant madness of Don Quixote is nothing else but an expression of such height of vainglory as reading of romance may produce in pusillanimous men. Also rage and madness of love are but great indignations of them in whose brains is predominant contempt from their enemies or their mistresses. And the pride taken in form and behavior hath made divers men run mad, and to be so accounted, under the name of fantastic. And as these are the examples of extremities, so also are there examples too many of the degrees, which may therefore be well accounted follies, as it is a degree of the first for a man, without certain evidence, to think himself to be inspired, or to have any other effect of God's Holy Spirit than other godly men have. Of the second, for a man continually to speak his mind in accento of other men's Greek or Latin sentences. Of the third, much of the present gallantry in love and duel. Of rage, a degree is malice, and of fantastic madness, affectation. As the former examples exhibit to us madness and the degrees thereof, proceeding from the excess of self-opinion, so also there be other examples of madness and the degrees thereof, proceeding from too much vain fear and dejection, as in those melancholy men that have imagined themselves brittle as glass, or have had some other like imagination. And degrees hereof are all those exorbitant and causeless fears which we commonly observe in melancholy persons. Of Almighty God, from Leviathan. Hitherto of the knowledge of things natural, and of the passions that arise naturally from them. Now, forasmuch as we give names not only to things natural but also to supernatural, and by all names we ought to have some meaning and conception, it followeth in the next place to consider what thoughts and imaginations of the mind we have, when we take into our mouths the most blessed name of God, and the names of those virtues we attribute unto him, as also what image cometh into the mind at hearing the name of Spirit, or the name of Angel, good or bad. And forasmuch as God Almighty is incomprehensible, it followeth that we can have no conception or image of the deity, and consequently all his attributes signify our inability and defect of power to conceive anything concerning his nature, and not any conception of the same, excepting only this, that there is a God. For the effects we acknowledge naturally do include a power of their producing, before they were produced, and that power presupposeth something existent that hath such power. And the thing so existing with power to produce, if it were not eternal, must needs have been produced by somewhat before it, and that again by something else before that, till we come to an eternal, that is to say, the first, power of all powers, and first cause of all causes. And this is it which all men conceive by the name of God, implying eternity, incomprehensibility, and omnipotency. And thus all that will consider may know that God is, though not what he is. Even a man that is born blind, though it be not possible for him to have any imagination what kind of thing fire is, yet he cannot but know that something there is that men call fire, because it warmeth him. And whereas we attribute to God Almighty seeing, hearing, speaking, knowing, loving, and the like, by which names we understand something in men to whom we attribute them, we understand nothing by them in the nature of God. For, as it is well reasoned, shall not the God that made the eye see and the ear hear? So it is also, if we say, shall God which made the eye not see without the eye, or that made the ear not hear without the ear, or that made the brain not know without the brain, or that made the heart not love without the heart. The attributes, therefore, given unto the deity are such as signify either our incapacity or our reverence. Our incapacity when we say incomprehensible and infinite, our reverence when we give him those names which amongst us are the names of those things we most magnify and commend, as omnipotent, omniscient, just, merciful, etc. And when God Almighty giveth those names to himself in the Scriptures, it is but anthropopathos, that is to say, by descending to our manner of speaking, without which we are not capable of understanding him. End of section 40. Read by Jeffrey Stumpf, Portland, Oregon, 2023.
Section 41 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswax Candle. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. Selected excerpts by Ernst, Theodor, Wilhelm, Hoffmann. Hoffmann's character is one of the most singular and contradictory in all that eccentric group of German romanticists. His sarcastic wit and flashes of humour made him popular with his companions, and his society was much sought after. But he inspired rather fear than love, for he was reckless in his indiscretions and ruthless in giving offence. Of all art he took a serious view. "There is no art which is not sacred," he said, and yet he felt a repugnance to looking at things from their serious side. "These are odiosa," was one of his familiar phrases. In his character, as in his work, there is much that suggests Poe, and the quality of his weird and often delicate fancy reminds one of Hawthorne. The unquestioned mastery of language and description that he displays is weakened by his uncontrolled mannerisms, and his wayward imagination often injures his finest flights of fancy. He delighted to make his studies of men in the borderlands between reason and madness. For him the step was always a short one into the misty realm of ghosts and doubles and startling visions. This love of the marvellous increased as he grew older. And yet, as Professor Kuno-Franke has said, Hoffmann, with all his somnambulism and madness, was at the same time a master of realistic description and of psychological analysis. Ernst Theodor Wilhelm Hoffmann was born at Königsberg on July 24, 1776. The unpleasant relations subsisting between his parents led to their separation when he was still a child, and to the lack of happy home influences he attributed much of the misery which his habits brought upon him in later years. He adopted the legal profession, in which his father had distinguished himself, and he began his career under promising auspices. He served a term as assessor in Posen, in the then newly acquired Polish provinces. But in consequence of a thoughtless bit of folly, he was transferred to the remote little town of Ploszcz, whither he went with his young Polish wife in 1802, and where he gave himself up to wild and extravagant gaiety. Life seemed to open up brightly before him once more when he received an appointment to Warsaw, but his career in that motley world was brought to an abrupt end in 1806 by the troops of Napoleon. The bit of folly which led to Hoffmann's removal to Ploszcz reveals incidentally his remarkable versatility. He was an excellent draftsman, and some of the best remembered caricatures of Napoleon were made by him. It was a series of witty caricatures of prominent men in Posen that gave offence to certain high officials there, upon whose complaint he was removed. Throughout his life Hoffmann continued to practice this art. During his martyr years in Bamberg, he eked out his scanty income by painting family portraits, and he acted as scene painter for a theatrical company, with which he subsequently became connected. But his professional work in Bamberg was of quite a different character. In the period of penury and hardship that followed the loss of his government post, Hoffmann had gone to Berlin, and cast about for any employment that would afford him support. He secured the position of musical director of the theatre at Bamberg. Hoffmann was a composer of no mean talent. His work had sufficient merit to win and hold the esteem of Weber, although in the strife between the Italian school and the new national German school, of which the Freischütz was the symbol and example, Hoffmann sided with Spontini and the Italians. Nevertheless, he was an ardent admirer of the genius of Beethoven, for whose work he made propaganda, and in his passionate admiration of Mozart, he went so far as to adopt the name of Amadeus instead of his own Wilhelm. Indeed, to most of his readers perhaps he is known as E.T.A. rather than E.T.W. Hoffmann. His masterly analysis of Don Giovanni is a choice piece of musical criticism not without value today. In his management of the Bamberg Theatre, Hoffmann was guided by high artistic ideals. Through his influence, several of Calderon's plays were produced, but the incubus of the Napoleonic Wars rested upon every enterprise, and the theatre had to be closed. Hoffmann still held the post of correspondent of the Musical Gazette of Leipzig, but had no adequate income. He led a wretched life as musical director of a troupe which played alternately in Leipzig and in Dresden. He was in Dresden during the siege, and while the bullets flew thick around him, he wrote with enthusiastic exultation one of his best tales, The Goldene Topf, the Golden Pot, which Carlyle translated for his collection of German romances. It was during this period also that he set Fuque's Undine to music, and the opera was produced at the Berlin Opera House. All this is aside from Hoffmann's literary work, upon which his fame is solely founded. His early years, with their varied experiences in strange places and amid exciting scenes, supplied his pen with inexhaustible material. His first characteristic contribution to literature was the Fantasiestücke in Callot's Manière, fantasy pieces in the style of Callot. These were a collection of his articles that had been published in the Musical Gazette, striking pen sketches in the manner of the celebrated and eccentric French engraver of the early 17th century, Jacques Callot. In the following year, 1815, appeared Die Elixir des Teufels, the Devil's Elixir. This work made his literary reputation sure. Among the most widely known of his numerous books is the collection of tales bearing the general title of Die Serapionsbrüder, the Serapion Brethren. The name was derived from an association of kindred spirits in Berlin, which happened to hold its first meeting on the night of the anniversary of St. Serapion. Among the occasional guests of this coterie was Oehlenschläger, who, in introducing a young countryman of his, wrote to Hoffmann, "Dip him also a little into the magic sea of your humour, respected friend, and teach him how a man can be a philosopher and seer of the world under the ironical mantle of the madhouse, and what is more, an amiable man as well." These words admirably characterize the peculiar quality of Hoffmann's strange blending of wit, wisdom, and madness. His amiability appears probably most conspicuously in the Kater Murr, Tomcat Moor's views of life. The satire is keen but genial, and of the author's more ambitious works, this is his most finished production. But it is in the shorter tales that the artist displays his highest excellence. The serious philosopher in the garb of a madman, and the tender-hearted poet telling quaint fairy tales. Spiritually, he is related to Jean-Paul, but missed his depth and greatness. The lyric swing, the wild imagination, the serious undercurrent beneath the sprightly wit, the biting satire, and the playful fancy assure him generations of readers among his countrymen, and numerous translations attest his popularity in England and America. The rest of the story of Hoffmann's sad life is soon told. After the peace which concluded the Napoleonic Wars, he was restored to his official position in 1816, this time in the High Tribunal of Berlin, and his seniority was acknowledged as if he had served without a break. Here he found himself in the midst of a choice and congenial circle. Hitzig, his biographer, Fuqua, Chamisso. His dissolute ways, however, never completely abandoned, led finally to the disease which terminated in his death. He died literally inch by inch, though eager to live in what pitiable conditions soever, and to the end, when his vital functions were almost suspended, his mind and imagination remained unimpaired. He died on June the 25th, 1822. Hoffmann's writings, like himself, are full of strange contradictions. He was an Epicurean to the point of weakness, and a Stoic to the point of heroic endurance. At the very portals of death, he continued to write in his own fantastic vein, and at the same time was inspired to compose a tale, Des Vetters Eckfenster, the cousin's corner window. which is so unlike his usual style that lovers of Émile Sylvestre would take pleasure in its serene and grave philosophy. He preferred to remain a riddle to himself, a riddle which he always dreaded to have solved, wrote a friend, and he demanded that he should be regarded as a sacred, inexplicable hieroglyph. From The Golden Pot. Stir not the emerald leaves of the palm trees in soft sighing and rustling as if kissed by the breath of the morning wind? Awakened from their sleep, they move and mysteriously whisper of the wonders which from the far distance approach like tones of melodious harps. The azure rolls from the walls, and floats like airy vapour to and fro, but dazzling beams shoot through it, and whirling and dancing, as in jubilee of childlike sport, it mounts and mounts to immeasurable height, and vaults itself over the palm trees. But brighter and brighter shoots beam on beam, till in boundless expanse opens the grove where I behold Anselmus. Here glowing hyacinths and tulips and roses lift their fair heads, and their perfumes and loveliest sound call to the happy youth. Wander, wander among us, our beloved, for thou understandest us. Our perfume is the longing of love. We love thee, and are thine for evermore. The golden rays burn in glowing tones. We are fire, kindled by love. Perfume is longing, but fire is desire. And dwell we not in thy bosom? We are thy own. The dark bushes, the high trees rustle and sound. Come to us, thou loved, thou happy one. Fire is desire, but hope is our cool shadow. Lovingly we rustle around thy head, for thou understandest us, because love dwells in thy breast. The brooks and fountains murmur and patter. Loved one, walk not so quickly by. Look into our crystal. Thy image dwells in us, which we preserve with love, for thou hast understood us. In the triumphal choir, bright birds are singing. Hear us, hear us. We are joy, we are delight, the rapture of love. But anxiously Anselmus turns his eyes to the glorious temple which rises behind him in the distance. The fair pillars seem trees, and the capitals and friezes acanthus leaves, which in wondrous wreaths and figures form splendid decorations. Anselmus walks to the temple. He views with inward delight the variegated marble, the steps with their strange veins of moss. Ah, no, cries he, as if in the excess of rapture. She is not far from me now. She is near. Then advances Serpentina in the fullness of beauty and grace from the temple. She bears the golden pot from which a bright lily has sprung. The nameless rapture of infinite longing glows in her meek eyes. She looks at Anselmus and says, Ah, dearest, the lily has sent forth her bowl. What we longed for is fulfilled. Is there a happiness to equal ours? Anselmus clasps her with the tenderness of warmest ardour. The lily burns in flaming beams over his head, and louder move the trees and bushes. Clearer and gladder play the brooks. The birds, the shining insects dance in the waves of perfume. A gay, bright, rejoicing tumult in the air, in the water, in the earth is holding the festival of love. Now rush sparkling streaks, gleaming over all the bushes. Diamonds look from the ground like shining eyes. Strange vapours are wafted hither on sounding wings. They are the spirits of the elements who do homage to the lily, and proclaim the happiness of Anselmus. Then Anselmus raises his head, as if encircled with a beamy glory. Is it looks? Is it words? Is it song? You hear the sound. Serpentina, belief in thee, love of thee, has unfolded to my soul the inmost spirit of nature. Thou hast brought me the lily which sprung from gold, from the primeval force of the world, before phosphorus had kindled the spark of thought. This lily is knowledge of the sacred harmony of all beings, and in this do I live in highest blessedness for evermore. Yes, I, thrice happy, have perceived what was highest. I must indeed love thee for ever, O Serpentina. Never shall the golden blossoms of the lily grow pale, for like belief and love, this knowledge is eternal. Carlyle's translation. Nutcracker and the King of Mice, from the Serapion Brethren. As soon as Mary was alone, she set rapidly to work to do the thing which was chiefly at her heart to accomplish, and which, though she scarcely knew why, she somehow did not like to set about in her mother's presence. She had been holding Nutcracker, wrapped in the handkerchief, carefully in her arms all this time. She now laid him softly down on the table, gently unrolled the handkerchief, and examined his wounds. Nutcracker was very pale, but at the same time he was smiling with a melancholy and pathetic kindliness which went straight to Mary's heart. "Oh, my darling little Nutcracker," she said very softly, "don't you be vexed because brother Fritz has hurt you so. He didn't mean it, you know. He is only a little bit hardened with his soldiering and that. But he is a good, nice boy, I can assure you, and I'll take the greatest care of you and nurse you till you're quite better and happy again. And your teeth shall be put in again for you, and your shoulder set right. Godpapa Drosselmeyer will see to that. He knows how to do things of the kind." Mary could not finish what she was going to say, because at the mention of Godpapa Drosselmeyer, friend Nutcracker made a most horrible, ugly face. A sort of green sparkle of much sharpness seemed to dart out of his eyes. This was only for an instant, however, and just as Mary was going to be terribly frightened, she found that she was looking at the very same nice, kindly face with the pathetic smile which she had seen before, and she saw plainly that it was nothing but some draught of air making the lamp flicker that had seemed to produce the change. "Well," she said, "I certainly am a silly girl to be so easily frightened, and think that a wooden doll would make faces at me. But I'm too fond, really, of Nutcracker, because he's so funny and kind and nice, and so he must be taken the greatest care of and properly nursed till he's quite well." With which she took him in her arms again, approached the cupboard, and kneeling down beside it, said to her new doll, "I'm going to ask a favour of you, Miss Clara, that you will give up your bed to this poor, sick, wounded Nutcracker, and make yourself as comfortable as you can on the sofa here. Remember that you are quite well and strong yourself, or you wouldn't have such fat red cheeks, and that there are very few dolls indeed who have as comfortable a sofa as this to lie upon." Miss Clara, in her Christmas full dress, looked very grand and disdainful, and said not so much as "muck." "Very well," said Mary. "Why should I make a fuss and stand on any ceremony?" Took the bed and moved it forward, laid Nutcracker carefully and tenderly down on it, wrapped another pretty ribbon, taken from her own dress, about his hurt shoulder, and drew the bedclothes up to his nose. "But he shan't stay with that nasty Clara," she said, and moved the bed with Nutcracker in it up to the upper shelf, so that it was placed near the village in which Fritz's hussars had their cantonments. She closed the cupboard, and was moving away to go to bed, when, listen, children, there began a slow, soft rustling and rattling, and a sort of whispering noise, all round, in all directions, and from all quarters of the room, behind the stove, under the chairs, behind the cupboards. The clock on the wall warned louder and louder, but could not strike. Mary looked at it, and saw that the big gilt owl which was on the top of it had drooped its wings so that they covered the whole of the clock, and had stretched its cat-like head with the crooked beak a long way forward. And the warning kept growing louder and louder, with distinct words: "Clocks, clockies, stop ticking. No sound, but cautious warning. Mousy King's ears are fine. Brr, brr. Only sing poom, poom. Sing the olden song of doom. Prr, prr, poom, poom. Bells go chime. Soon rings out the fated time." And then came poom, poom, quite hoarsely and smothered, 12 times. Mary grew terribly frightened, and was going to rush away as best she could, when she noticed that Godpapa Drosselmeyer was up on the top of the clock instead of the owl, with his yellow coat-tails hanging down on both sides like wings. But she manned herself, and called out in a loud voice of anguish, "Godpapa, Godpapa, what are you doing up there for? Come down to me and don't frighten me so terribly, you naughty, naughty Godpapa Drosselmeyer." But then there began a sort of wild kickering and queaking everywhere, all about, and presently there was a sound as of running and trotting, as of thousands of little feet behind the walls, and thousands of little lights began to glitter out between the chinks of the woodwork. But they were not lights. No, little glittering eyes. And Mary became aware that everywhere mice were peeping and squeezing themselves out through every chink. Presently they were trotting and galloping in all directions over the room, orderly bodies continually increasing of mice, forming themselves into regular troops and squadrons in good order, just as Fritz's soldiers did when manoeuvres were going on. As Mary was not afraid of mice, as many children are, she could not help being amused by this, and her first alarm had nearly left her when there came such a sharp and terrible piping noise that the blood ran cold in her veins. Ah, what did she see then? Well, truly, kind reader, I know that your heart is in the right place, just as much as my friend Field Marshal Fritz's is itself. But if you had seen what now came before Mary's eyes, you would have made a clean pair of heels of it. Nay, I consider that you would have plumped into your bed and drawn the blankets further over your head than necessity demanded. But poor Mary hadn't it in her power to do any such thing, because right at her feet, as if impelled by some subterranean power, sand and lime and broken stone came bursting up, and then 7 mouse heads, with 7 shining crowns upon them, rose through the floor, hissing and piping in a most horrible way. Quickly the body of the mouse, which had those 7 crowned heads, forced its way up through the floor, and this enormous creature shouted with its 7 heads aloud to the assembled multitude, squeaking to them with all the 7 mouths in full chorus. And then the entire army set itself in motion, and went trot, trot, right up to the cupboard, and in fact to Mary, who was standing beside it. Mary's heart had been beating so with terror that she had thought it must jump out of her breast and that she must die. But now it seemed to her as if the blood in her veins stood still. Half fainting, she leant backwards, and then there was a klr, klr, prr, and the pane of the cupboard, which she had broken with her elbow, fell in shivers to the floor. She felt for a moment a sharp stinging pain in her arm, but still this seemed to make her heart lighter. She heard no more of the quaking and piping. Everything was quiet, and though she didn't dare to look, she thought the noise of the glass breaking had frightened the mice back to their holes. But what came to pass then? Right behind Mary, a movement seemed to commence in the cupboard, as small faint voices began to be heard saying, "Come, awake, measures take, out to the fight, out to the fight, shield the right, arm and away, this is the night." And harmonica bells began ringing as prettily as you please. "Oh, that's my little peal of bells," cried Mary, and went nearer and looked in. Then she saw that there was bright light in the cupboard, and everything busily in motion there, dolls and little figures of various kinds all running about together and struggling with their little arms. At this point, Nutcracker rose from his bed, cast off the bedclothes, and sprung with both feet onto the floor of the shelf, crying out at the top of his voice, "Knack, knack, knack! Stupid mousy pack! All their skulls will crack! Mousy pack, knack, knack! Mousy pack, crick and crack! Cowardly lot of schnack!" And with this he drew his little sword, waved it in the air and cried, "Ye trusty vassals, brethren and friends, are you ready to stand by me in this great battle?" Immediately 3 scaramouches, 1 pantaloon, 4 chimney sweeps, 2 zither players, and a drummer cried in eager accents, "Yes, your highness, we will stand by you in loyal duty. We will follow you to the death, the victory, and the fray." And they precipitated themselves after Nutcracker, who in the excitement of the moment had dared that perilous leap, to the bottom shelf. Now they might well dare this perilous leap, for not only had they plenty of clothes on, of cloth and silk, but besides there was not much in their insides except cotton and sawdust, so that they plumped down like little wood sacks. But as for poor Nutcracker, he would certainly have broken his arms and legs, for bethink you, it was nearly 2 feet from where he had stood to the shelf below, and his body was as fragile as if he had been made of elm wood. Yes, Nutcracker would have broken his arms and legs had not Miss Clara started up from her sofa at the moment of his spring, and received the hero, drawn sword and all, in her tender arms. "Oh, you dear good Clara," cried Mary, "how I did misunderstand you. I believe you were quite willing to let dear Nutcracker have your bed." But Miss Clara now cried as she pressed the young hero gently to her silken breast, "Oh, my lord, go not into this battle in danger, sick and wounded as you are. See how your trusty vassals, clowns and pantaloon, chimney sweep, zither men and drummer, are already arrayed below, and the puzzle figures in my shelf here are in motion and preparing for the fray. Deign then, O my lord, to rest in these arms of mine, and contemplate your victory from a safe coign of advantage." Thus spoke Clara, but Nutcracker behaved so impatiently, and kicked so with his legs, that Clara was obliged to put him down on the shelf in a hurry. However, he at once sank gracefully on one knee, and expressed himself as follows: "O lady, the kind protection and aid which you have afforded me will ever be present to my heart, in battle and in victory." On this Clara bowed herself so as to be able to take hold of him by his arms, raised him gently up, quickly loosened her girdle, which was ornamented with many spangles, and would have placed it about his shoulders. But the little man drew himself swiftly 2 steps back, laid his hand upon his heart, and said with much solemnity, "O lady, do not bestow this mark of your favour upon me, for—" He hesitated, gave a deep sigh, took the ribbon with which Mary had bound him from his shoulders, pressed it to his lips, put it on as a cognizance for the fight, and waving his glittering sword, sprang like a bird over the ledge of the cupboard down to the floor. You'll observe, kind reader, that Nutcracker, even before he really came to life, had felt and understood all Mary's goodness and regard, and that it was because of his gratitude and devotion to her that he would not take or wear even a ribbon of Miss Clara's, though it was exceedingly pretty and charming. This good, true-hearted Nutcracker preferred Mary's much commoner and more unpretending token. But what is going to happen further now? At the moment when Nutcracker sprang down, the creaking and piping commenced again, worse than ever. Alas, under the big table, the hordes of the mouse army had taken up a position, densely massed, under the command of the terrible mouse with the 7 heads. So what is to be the result? The battle. "Beat the général, trusty vassal drummer," cried Nutcracker very loud, and immediately the drummer began to roll his drum in a most splendid style, so that the windows of the glass cupboard rattled and resounded. Then there began a cracking and a clattering inside, and Mary saw all the lids of the boxes in which Fritz's army was quartered bursting open, and the soldiers all came out and jumped down to the bottom shelf, where they formed up in good order. Nutcracker hurried up and down the ranks, speaking words of encouragement. "There's not a dog of a trumpeter taking the trouble to sound a call," he cried in a fury. Then he turned to the pantaloon, who who was looking decidedly pale, and wobbling his long chin a good deal, said in a tone of solemnity, "I know how brave and experienced you are, General. What is essential here is a rapid comprehension of the situation, and an immediate utilization of the passing moment. I entrust you with the command of the cavalry and artillery. You can do without a horse. Your own legs are long, and you can gallop on them as fast as is necessary. Do your duty." Immediately Pantaloon put his long, lean fingers to his mouth and gave such a piercing crow that it rang as if 100 little trumpets had been sounding lustily. Then there began a tramping and a neighing in the cupboard, and Fritz's dragoons and cuirassiers, but above all the new glittering hussars, marched out, and then came to a halt, drawn up on the floor. They then marched past Nutcracker by regiments, with guidons flying and bands playing, after which they wheeled into line and formed up at right angles to the line of march. Upon this, Fritz's artillery came rattling up, and formed action front in advance of the halted cavalry. Then it went boom, boom, and Mari saw the sugar plums doing terrible execution amongst the thickly massed mouse battalions, which were powdered quite white by them, and greatly put to shame. But a battery of heavy guns, which had taken up a strong position on Mamma's footstool, was what did the greatest execution, and poom, 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 kept up a murderous fire of gingerbread nuts into the enemy's ranks with most destructive effect, mowing the mice down in great numbers. The enemy, however, was not materially checked in his advance, and had even possessed himself of 1 or 2 of the heavy guns, when there came prr, 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 and Mari could scarcely see what was happening, for smoke and dust. But this much is certain, that every corps engaged fought with the utmost bravery and determination, and it was for a long time doubtful which side would gain the day. The mice kept on developing fresh bodies of their forces as they were advanced to the scene of action. Their little silver balls, like pills in size, which they delivered with great precision, their musketry practice being especially fine, took effect even inside the glass cupboard. Clara and Gertrude ran up and down in utter despair, wringing their hands and loudly lamenting. "Must I, the very loveliest doll in all the world, perish misery in the very flower of my youth?" cried Miss Clara. "Oh, was it for this," wept Gertrude, "that I have taken such pains to conserve myself all these years? Must I be shut here in my own drawing-room after all?" On this they fell into each other's arms and howled so terribly that you could hear them above all the din of the battle. For you have no idea of the hurly-burly that went on now, dear auditor. It went purr, purr, poof, piff, shitterling, boom, broom, boom, all confusedly and higgledy-piggledy, and the Mouse King and the mice squeaked and screamed, and then again Nutcracker's powerful voice was heard shouting words of command and issuing important orders, and he was seen striding along amongst his battalions in the thick of the fire. Pantaloon had made several most brilliant cavalry charges, and covered himself with glory. But Fritz's hussars were subjected, by the mice, to a heavy fire of very evil-smelling shot, which made horrid spots on their red tunics. This caused them to hesitate and hang rather back for a time. Pantaloon made them take ground to the left in echelon, and in the excitement of the moment, he, with his dragoons and cuirassiers, executed a somewhat analogous movement. That is to say, they brought up the right shoulder, wheeled to the left, and marched home to their quarters. This had the effect of bringing the battery of artillery on the footstool into imminent danger, and it was not long before a large body of exceedingly ugly mice delivered such a vigorous assault on this position that the whole of the footstool, with the guns and gunners, fell into the enemy's hands. Nutcracker seemed much disconcerted, and ordered his right wing to commence a retrograde movement. A soldier of your experience, my dear Fritz, knows well that such a movement is almost tantamount to a regular retreat, and you grieve with me in anticipation for the disaster which threatens the army of Mari's beloved little Nutcracker. But turn your glance in the other direction, and look at this left wing of Nutcracker's, where all is still going well, and you will see that there is yet much hope for the Commander-in-Chief and his cause. During the hottest part of the engagement, masses of mouse cavalry had been quietly debouching from under the chest of drawers, and had subsequently made a most determined advance upon the left wing of Nutcracker's force, uttering loud and horrible queakings. But what a reception they met with! Very slowly, as the nature of the terrain necessitated, for the ledge at the bottom of the cupboard had to be passed, the regiment of motto figures, commanded by 2 Chinese emperors, advanced and formed square. These fine, brilliantly uniformed troops, consisting of gardeners, Tyrolese, tungooses, hairdressers, harlequins, cupids, lions, tigers, unicorns, and monkeys, fought with the utmost courage, coolness, and steady endurance. This battalion d'élite would have wrested the victory from the enemy, had not one of his cavalry captains, pushing forward in a rash and foolhardy manner, made a charge upon one of the Chinese emperors, and bitten off his head. This Chinese emperor in his fall knocked over and smothered a couple of tungooses and a unicorn, and this created a gap, through which the enemy effected a rush which resulted in the whole battalion being bitten to death. But the enemy gained little advantage by this, for as soon as one of the mouse cavalry soldiers bit one of these brave adversaries to death, he found that there was a small piece of printed paper sticking in his throat, of which he died in a moment. Still, this was of small advantage to Nutcracker's army, which, having once commenced a retrograde movement, went on retreating farther and farther, suffering greater and greater loss, so that the unfortunate Nutcracker found himself driven back close to the front of the cupboard, with a very small remnant of his army. "Bring up the reserves! Pantaloon, Scaramouche, Drummer, where the devil have you got to?" shouted Nutcracker, who was still reckoning on reinforcements from the cupboard. And there did, in fact, advance a small contingent of brown gingerbread men and women, with gilt faces, hats, and helmets. But they laid about them so clumsily that they never hit any of the enemy, and soon knocked off the cap of their commander-in-chief, Nutcracker himself. And the enemy's chasseurs soon bit their legs off, so that they tumbled topsy-turvy, and killed several of Nutcracker's companions in arms into the bargain. Nutcracker was now hard pressed, and closely hemmed in by the enemy, and in a position of extreme peril. He tried to jump the bottom ledge of the cupboard, but his legs were not long enough. Clara and Gertrude had fainted, so that they could give him no assistance. Hussars and heavy dragoons came charging up at him, and he shouted in wild despair, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" At this moment, 2 of the enemy's riflemen seized him by his wooden cloak, and the king of the mice went rushing up to him, squeaking in triumph out of all his 7 throats. Mary could contain herself no longer. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker!" she sobbed, took off her left shoe without very distinctly knowing what she was about, and threw it as hard as she could into the thick of the enemy, straight at their king. Instantly, everything vanished and disappeared. All was silence. Nothing was to be seen. But Mary felt a more stinging pain than before in her left arm, and fell on the floor insensible. End of section 41.
Section 42 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. Selected excerpts by James Hogg. James Hogg, 1770 to 1835. One of the great names in modern Scottish border poetry is James Hogg, better known as the Ettrick Shepherd, a child of nature, nourished in the border glens and beside border streams on the stories and traditions of Scotland. Born in 1770 in Ettrick, which is situated in one of the most mountainous and picturesque districts in the south of Scotland, when he was 30, he had but a half a year's schooling, for he was sent to fold the sheep when but 7 years old, and at 16 attained to the dignity of shepherd. in which capacity he remained until he met Sir Walter Scott, 1801, who felt that in him he had found a true son of nature and genius, hardly conscious of his power, and advised him to publish his poems. At this time, Hogg is described by the son of his master as above middle height, of faultless symmetry of form. His face was round and full, and of a ruddy complexion, with bright blue eyes that beamed with gaiety, glee, and good humor. His head was covered with a singular profusion of light brown hair, which he was obliged to wear coiled up under his hat. On entering church on Sunday, he used, on lifting his hat, to raise his right hand to assist a graceful shake of his head in lying back his long hair, which rolled down his back and fell almost to his loins. And every female eye was upon him, as with light step he ascended the stair to the gallery where he sat. From 1810 to 1816 he lived in Edinburgh, but then went back to Eltrive Lake in Yarrow, where his best verse was inspired. Of his early work, which was done in Blackhouse Glen, far from human life, alone with his lambs and dogs, the poet says, "For several years my compositions consisted wholly of songs and ballads, made up for the lasses to sing in chorus, and a proud man I was when I first heard the rosy nymphs chanting my uncouth strains and jeering me by the still clear appellation of Jamie the Poeter." Hogg's poetry, which is happiest when it has a strong flavor of dialect, is notable for its fanciful humor or rollicking spirit of song, its love of the weird and wonderful, its pictures of brownies, fairies, and country life, but his ambition to rival in their own way the greatest poets of his time was curiously egotistic. The Queen's Wake, his most ambitious effort, was written in imitation of Scott's historical romances, and he boasted that he had beaten him in his own line. Though a most prolific writer, the greater part of his verse is charming. He died at Eltrive Lake, November 21st, 1835, aged 65. When Maggie gangs away. Oh, what will a' the lads do when Maggie gangs away? Oh, what will a' the lads do when Maggie gangs away? There's no a heart in a' the glen that disna dread the day, or what will a' the lads do when Maggie gangs away? Young Jock has ta'en the hill ford, a waffle white is he. Poor Harry's ta'en the bed ford, and laid him down to day. And Sandy's gone into the kirk, and learning fast to pray. And oh, what will the lads do when Maggie gangs away? The young laird of the Langshaw has drunk her health in wine. The priest has said, in confidence, the lassie was divine. And that is mair in maiden's praise than any priest should say. But oh, what will the lads do when Maggie gangs away? The wailing in our green glen that day will quaver high. 'Twill draw the redbreast frae the wood, the laverock frae the sky. The fairies frae their beds o' dew will rise and join the lay. And hey, what a day 'twill be when Maggie gangs away. The Skylark. Bird of the wilderness, blithesome and cumberless, sweet be thy matin o'er moorland and lea, emblem of happiness, blessed is thy dwelling place, O to abide in the desert with thee. Wild is thy lay and loud, far in the downy cloud. Love gives it energy, love gives it birth. Where on thy dewy wing, where art thou journeying? Thy lay is in heaven, thy love is on earth. O'er fell and fountain sheen, o'er moor and mountain green, o'er the red streamer that heralds the day, o'er the cloudlet dim, o'er the rainbow's rim, musical cherub, soar singing away. Then when the gloaming comes, low in the heather blooms, sweet will thy welcome and bed of love be, emblem of happiness. Blessed is thy dwelling place, O to abide in the desert with thee. Donald MacDonald, heir, wooed and married and My name it is Donald MacDonald. I live in the Highlands so grand. I have followed our banner and will do whenever my Maker has land. When ranked above the blue bonnets, nae danger can fear me ava. I ken that my brethren around me are either to conquer or fa. Brogues and broken and broken and brogues and and is nae her very well off, wi' her brogues and broken and What though we befriended young Charlie, to tell it I dinna think shame. Poor lad, he came to us but barely, and reckoned our mountains his name. 'Twere true that our reason forbade us, but tenderness carried the day. Had Geordie come friendless among us, wi' him we had a gone away. Sword and buckler and buckler and sword and Now for George will encounter the devil with sword and buckler and And I would eagerly press him, the keys o' the east to retain, for should he gie up the possession, we'll soon have to force them again. Then yield up an inch with dishonour, though it were my finishing blow. He may depend on MacDonald, with his Highlanders in a row. Knees and elbows and elbows and knees and depend upon Donald MacDonald, his knees and elbows and Wad Bonaparte land at Fort William, all the Europe no longer chagrin. I laugh when I think how we'd gall him, with bullet, with steel, and with stain. With rocks of the Nevis and Garry, we'd rattle off frae our shore, or lull him asleep in a cairney, and sing him Loch Hobber no more. Stains and bullets and bullets and stains and we'll finish the Corsican Colin with stains and bullets and For the Gordon is good in a hurry, and Campbell is steel in the bane, and Grant and Mackenzie and Murray, and Cameron were hurkle to none. The Steward is sturdy and loyal, and say is MacLeod and Mackay, and I, their guide Brither MacDonald, shall ne'er be last in the fray. Brogues and Bracken and Bracken and brogues and up with the bonny blue bonnet, the kilt and the feather and When the kye comes home. Come all you jolly shepherds that whistle through the glen, I'll tell you of a secret that courtiers dinna ken. What is the greatest bliss that the tongue o' man can name? 'Tis to woo a bonny lassie when the kye comes home. When the kye comes home, when the kye comes home, 'tween the gloaming and the murk, when the kye comes home. 'Tis not beneath a coronet, nor canopy of state, 'tis not on couch of velvet, nor arbor of the great. 'Tis beneath a spreading birk, in a glen without the name, wi' a bonny, bonny lassie, when the kye comes home. There the blackbird bigs his nest, for the maid he loves to see, and on the topmost bough, a happy bird is he, where he pours his melting ditty, and love is the theme, and he'll woo his bonny lassie, when the kye comes home. When the bluet bears a pearl, and the daisy turns a pea, and the bonny Lucan gowan has folded up her then the laverock, frae the blue lift, drops down and thinks nae shame, to woo his bonny lassie, when the kye comes home. See yonder pocky shepherd, that lingers on the hill, his ewes are in the fauld, and his lambs are lying still. Yet he donna gang to bed, for his heart is in a flame, to meet his bonny lassie, when the kye comes home. When the little wee bit heart rises high in the breast, and the little wee bit stern rises red in the east, there's a joy so dear, that the heart can hardly frame, wi' a bonny, bonny lassie, when the kye comes home. Then since all nature joins in this love without alloy, wha would prove a traitor to nature's dearest joy? Or wha would choose a crown, wi' its perils and its fame, and miss his bonny lassie, when the kye comes home? End of section 42, read by Bryce Kreis, Ohio. Section 43 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. Ludvig Holberg, by William Morton Payne. Ludvig Holberg, 1684 to 1754, by William Morton Payne. The literature of modern Scandinavia was, like that of modern Germany, slow to emerge from the intellectual darkness of the Middle Ages, and the writer who ushers in the literature of modern Denmark was a boy of 16 when the 17th century rounded to its close. In Scandinavia, as in Germany, the Reformation had indeed been followed by a period of intellectual ferment, but the energies thus liberated found their chief vent in theological and political discussion. In Danish literature, this period is known as the Age of Learning, but it was an age which left humanism clean out of the question, and even its learning was of the narrow scholastic type. Into the world thus busied, which was destined during his lifetime, and largely owing to his activity to undergo so complete an intellectual transformation, Ludvig Holberg was born in Bergen, Norway, December 3rd, 1684. The accident of his birth in this Hansa town has led the Norwegians to claim him for their own and to dispute his title as the father of Danish literature. The facts are, of course, that Norway and Denmark were politically one until 1814, with a common language and a common intellectual center in Copenhagen. Nearly all the literature produced, whether by Danes or Norwegians, saw the light in the Danish capital, and it's properly to be described as Danish literature. Holberg saw Norway for the last time in 1705. It was in Denmark that he lived and wrote, and made for himself the greatest name in all Scandinavian literature. The principal authority for the facts of Holberg's life, except for the closing years, is a sort of autobiography originally published in his Opuscula Latina and afterwards translated into Danish with the title Trende Epistler, 3 Epistles. This little volume is candid, concise, and extremely readable, mingling jest with earnest in an altogether delightful fashion. The touch of the writer of satirical comedy is frequently seen, and the author describes his own foibles with the same sort of good humor that goes to the creation of the types immortalized in Den Dansk Skueplads, or collection of his plays. From this autobiography, we learn that Ludvig was the youngest of 12 children and was left an orphan at the age of 10. He went to school in Bergen and was then sent to Copenhagen for an examination. Being without the money needful for university study, he soon returned to Norway, where he taught for a year in a clergyman's family, incidentally preaching on occasion in his master's place, and giving great satisfaction in the latter capacity by the brevity of his discourses. With the money thus earned, he went back to Copenhagen, studied French and Italian, and passed a fairly creditable examination in philosophy and theology. In the autumn of 1704, with 60 rigsdaler in his pocket, he set out to see the world. Holberg's first glimpse of foreign lands was gained in about 2 months, and at cost of no little hardship. He got as far as Amsterdam and Aachen, and then home again. This was the first of the 5 foreign journeys that he made in about 20 years. In itself it was unimportant, but all the 5 taken together were of great significance both for him and his country. For from these excursions into the larger world of thought and action, he brought back nothing less than the great gift of European culture to bestow upon his fellow countrymen. Through him the light of the modern intelligence shone upon the darkness of the North. The freedom of the human spirit was asserting itself in many directions abroad. At home it was held in the shackles of tradition. Holberg learned of such men as Rabelais and Montaigne, Descartes and Bayle, Newton and Locke, Leibniz and Pufendorf, Spinoza and Grotius, and felt called upon to become their interpreter to his fellow countrymen. To this task he gave his life, and thanks to his efforts, the Scandinavian countries, in spite of their place apart, have never lagged far behind the rest of Europe. But it is eminently characteristic of their literature, from that time to the present, that its main inspiration has been thus brought from without, and Ibsen in 1864, leaving his country because its air seemed too sultry to breathe, but repeated the experience of Holberg a century and a half earlier. Holberg's second outing took him to Oxford, where he remained from 1705 to 1707, pursuing his studies and supporting himself by teaching music and the languages. It has been recently pointed out, mainly from internal evidence, that Addison was probably numbered among his friends made during this English sojourn, and that the germs of several of the comedies may be found in The Spectator and Tatler. The stay in Oxford was a turning point in Holberg's life, in the sense that when he returned it was to Copenhagen, not to Norway, and that he never thereafter set foot upon his native soil. After lecturing for a while in Copenhagen, he went abroad for a winter in Dresden, Leipzig, and Halle. Returning in 1708, he spent the 6 years following in teaching, and during this period published his first work, An Introduction to European History. The publication of this work got the author into a literary controversy, which is mainly significant because it first aroused Holberg's consciousness of his possession of the gift of satire and helped prepare the way for Potter Pars and the comedies. The dedication to the king of a historical work of minor importance won for Holberg an appointment as professor extraordinary at the university, a purely honorary post. He thought it a good deal of a joke that he should be appointed to lecture at the university, in view of his opinion of the subjects most industriously pursued in that institution. I could, he says, by good luck frame a syllogism after a fashion, but could by no means be sure whether it was in Barbara or Elizabeth. The question of subsistence in his unsalaried position was, however, anything but a joke, for his new dignity debarred him from giving private instruction, hitherto his mainstay. But there came presently a traveling stipend of 100 Rigsdaler annually, and thus slenderly provided, he set out in 1714 upon his fourth foreign journey, remaining more than 2 years away from home, for the most part in France and Italy. In the summer of 1716 he made his way home, and his Wanderjahre were over. The one foreign journey subsequently made by him took place 10 years later, when he was at the height of his fame. For 2 years after his return, Holberg lived in great poverty. At this time he published a treatise upon the law of nations, basing his work upon that of Grotius and Pufendorf. At last a chair became vacant at the university, and he was called to fill it. In 1718 he was installed in his professorship, and for the rest of his life remained, occupying higher and higher positions, in close official connection with the university. Metaphysics was a subject at first assigned him, and so with a wry face he became, and remained for 2 years, philosophe malgré lui. Brandes very plausibly finds in this enforced and distasteful occupation a main cause of the irony which was planted deep within his soul, and the active impulse which led to the development of his genius in its most characteristic phase. Peter Pars, the first of the works to which Holberg mainly owes his fame, was published in 1719-20. It is a mock epic in 4 books and extends to upwards of 6,000 lines. It is written in rhymed iambic hexameters of a very pedestrian gait. Although a poem in form, it is as destitute of the spirit of true poetry as is the Lutrin of Boileau which it suggests. Holberg was not a poet and could not become one. The gifts of irony and satire he had in the richest measure. His humor was all but the deepest, and his imagination was vivid upon every side but the poetic. His intellectual and human sympathies embraced nearly all the life and thought of mankind. He was of the Voltairean type, the incarnation of intelligence tempered by sympathy, and he even had his enthusiasms, although the superficial student might fail to find them. Most of these qualities appear in this his first great work, which recounts the adventures of a grocer of Kallenborg upon a journey to Arbus, It proceeds to be written by one Hans Mikkelsen and is provided with notes by an equally mythical Just Justison. Speaking through the mask of the latter, the author declares that it is the object of his work to ridicule the many ballads that are with so much eagerness read by the common people. He has also wished to poke fun at heroic verse. The poem is, from beginning to end, a travesty of the heroic epic, employing and turning to ridicule the supernatural machinery and the rhetorical devices of the classics of antiquity. Both the one and the other seemed absurd enough to this shrewd humorist, and probably the use of which the classics were put in an institution like the University of Copenhagen was sufficient to repress any impulse on the part of anybody to enter into their real spirit. In the course of his journeyings, Peter Pars is wrecked upon the island of Anholt, and the following passage relating to the inhabitants of that spot may be given to illustrate the poem. Anholt the island's name is answer he did say, and daily for seafarers the islanders do pray that they may come to shore. And answer oft is given, for hither storm-tossed ships quite frequently are driven. Good people are they now, although I fear 'tis true that they in former days were but a sorry crew. A very aged man, once guest of mine, I know, who told me of a priest that lived here long ago. His name I do not give, it need not mentioned be, who for a child baptized $1 charged as fee. And when 'twas asked of him upon what grounds and why he made this double charge, he boldly gave reply. 2 marks I am allowed for each child I baptize, and 2 for burial. Now rarely 'tis one dies of sickness in his bed, for hanged are nearly all, and thus my rightful dues I get, or not at all. Of yore their lives were evil, as we from this may tell. It little touches me, for here I do not dwell. But now we see that better they grow from day to day, for Christian lives they lead, and shipwrecks are their stay. A certain worthy Anholter felt so much aggrieved at this description that he petitioned to have the poem burned by the hangman. Another passage, which gave particular offense to the solemn pedants of the university, thus described an academic disputation. The entire hall was seen with syllogisms quaking, while some their outstretched hands and others fists were shaking. From off the learned brows salt perspiration ran, and most profusely from a venerable man who in the pulpit stood. There flew his head about, Greek-Latin shafts so thick, one could no longer doubt that nothing less than life and honor were at stake. Since for no trifle men would such a tumult make, tell me, Calliope, what deep, what grievous wrong hath to such passionate wrath stirred up this learned throng? What ails these sages now, whose minds the world illume, that here, like men made drunk or mad, they shout and fume? In spite of the indignation aroused by such passages, the poem escaped burning and the author punishment. Tradition says that the king read it and found it amusing, and the public read it as no Danish book had ever been read before. The author had his reward in the fame that suddenly came to him, and in the proud consciousness that posterity would atone for the injustice done him by his enemies. Some years later, in verses that come as near to being genuine poetry as any that Holberg ever penned, he referred to himself and his work in the following prophetic terms. Perchance, when in the grave his body mouldering lies, perchance, when with his death the voice of envy dies, another tone may swell, struck from another chord, and things now hidden men may view with sight restored. Admit the work does not display the scholar's lore. Admit that 'tis a fantasy and nothing more. Although of little use, yet with a work of art, for many learned books the wise men will not part. We now come to the most fruitful period of Holberg's activity, the creative period that gave to Denmark a national stage, and to universal literature a series of comedies that can be classed with those of Molière alone. The comedies of Aristophanes and Shakespeare are, of course, out of court. They constitute a distinct literary species with a divineness all its own. We owe the comedies of Holberg to the fact that King Frederick IV was fond of the theater, and the other fact that the foreign companies that gave plays in Copenhagen were not exactly successful in suiting the public taste. In this emergency, it was suggested that Danish plays might be ventured upon as an experiment, and Holberg was asked to try his hand at their composition. After some hesitation, he consented and soon had a batch of 5 comedies ready for the players. They were received by the public with great enthusiasm, and others followed in quick succession until no less than 28 had been produced, all within a period of about 5 years. When we consider the technical finish of these comedies, their wealth of invention and humor, and the variety of the figures that live and breathe in their pages, we must reckon their production as one of the most astonishing feats in the history of literature. The theater was opened to the public in 1722. 6 years later, Copenhagen was almost wholly destroyed by fire, and there was an end of theater going. In 1730, Christian VI came to the throne. The court became strictly puritanical, and the genial days of play acting were over. In 1747, under Frederick V, the theater was reopened, and for it, Holberg wrote 6 new plays, making 34 in all. These plays, to which the author himself gave the collective name of Den danske skueplads, the Danish stage, are the most important contribution yet by the Scandinavian genius to literature. To the student of Shakespeare or of Molière, the chronological order of the plays is a matter of the greatest consequence. To the student of Holberg, it has no significance whatever. The first of them is as finished and mature a production as any of those that come after. The only fact worth noting, perhaps, is that the comedies of the later period are less effective than those of the earlier, for the intervening score of years seem to have taken from the author's hand something of its cunning. One group of the comedies, 6 or 8 in number, deal with fantastic and allegorical subjects. Here we may mention Plutus, an imitation of Aristophanes, Ulysses von Ithacia, a jumble of incidents connected with the Trojan War, and Mélampe, a parody of French tragedy, and the only one of the comedies written largely in verse. Another group deals with the popular beliefs of a superstitious age, beliefs very real in Holberg's day and requiring considerable boldness to ridicule. This group of half a dozen includes Det Arabische Pulver, the Arabian powder, concerned with the impostures of alchemy, Uden hoved og hæl, without head or tail, which contrasts the 2 types of excessive credulity and excessive skepticism, and hexery, witchcraft, the hero of which makes a profitable business out of the black art. Many of the comedies depict humors in the Johnsonian sense, as Den Studesloos, the busy man, Den Vogelgesindied, the fickle-minded woman, Jean de France, depicting the dandy just returned from Paris, Jacob von Thibaut, depicting the braggart soldier, and then Honnête Ambition, the proper ambition, depicting the personality of the title-seeking snob. Another group of the plays depend for their interest upon pure intrigue, and of these, Honric og Pernille is perhaps the best, because the most symmetrical in construction. 4 of the comedies deserve more extended mention, because they display Holberg's highest powers of humorous satire, his keenest penetration, and his deepest moral earnestness. They are Den Politiske Candestober, the political pewterer, Jepa Burget, Erasmus Montanus, and Det Lycklige Skibrid, the fortunate shipwreck. In the first of these 4 plays, we have a humorous delineation of the man who, without any practical experience in the work of government or any knowledge of political science, boldly discusses questions of public policy and makes the most grotesque proposals for the welfare of the state. In Jeppe pa Burget, we have the story made familiar to us by the induction to the Taming of the Shrew. In his portrayal of a drunken peasant made for a day to believe himself a nobleman, Holberg achieved one of his greatest triumphs. It is not so much the drunken humor as a genuine humanity of the peasant that appeals to us, and the springs of pity are tapped no less than the springs of mirth. In Erasmus Montanus, which Brandes calls our deepest work, we have a study of the country youth who is sent to Copenhagen for his education, and who comes back to his simple home a pedantic prig, a superior person, scorning his family and old-time associates. Petty and insufferable as his training has made him, he is in some sort, after all, the representative of the intellectual life. And there is something almost tragic in the manner in which he is forced finally to succumb to prejudice, sacrificing the truth to his personal comfort. The special significance of that Lycaliche Skibrid is in the last of the 5 acts, which gives us the author's apologia pro vita sua, and strikes a note of earnestness that must arrest the attention. The hero is a satirical poet, brought to judgment by his enraged fellow citizens, and triumphantly acquitted by a righteous judge. It must not be forgotten, however, that the comedies, large as they loom in the history of Danish letters, represent only 5 or 6 years of a life prolonged to the scriptural tale, and almost Voltairian in its productiveness. Among the other works that must at least be mentioned are the Dänemark's Riga's History of the Kingdom of Denmark, the author's highest achievement as a historian, and the hero stories and heroine stories in Plutarch's manner, which were among the most popular of his prose writings. The most widely known of all Holberg's works is the Nicolai Klimi Eder Subterraneum, Niels Klim's Underground Journey, published at Leipzig in 1741 and soon after translated into Danish and almost every other European tongue. It is a philosophical romance of the type of Utopia and Gulliver, and champions a spirit of tolerance in religious and other intellectual concerns. The same liberal spirit breathes in the Moralske Tanker, Moral Reflections, of 1744. This work and the 5 volumes of Epistler, 1748 to 54, are about the last of Holberg's writings, and embody his ripest thought upon government, literature, philosophy, religion, and the practical conduct of life. If hitherto we have thought of Holberg as the northern prototype of Molière or Voltaire, he appears to us in his epistles rather in the light of a northern Montaigne. These brief essays, between 500 and 600 in number, afford the most intimate revelation of the author's life and intellectual attitude. They are charmingly ripe and genial work, and close in the worthiest imaginable way the long list of the writings with which for nearly 40 years he continued to enrich the national literature of which he had been the creator. Nearly 20 years before his death, Holberg, who had never married, expressed a determination to devote to public uses the modest fortune that he had accumulated. He finally decided to apply this fortune to the endowment of Sorb Academy, a sort of auxiliary of the university, and the gift was made effective several years before his death. In 1747 he received the title of nobility, but as Baron Holberg remained the same conscientious and unaffected citizen that he had been as a commoner. He accepted his title with simple dignity as a deserved recognition of his services to the state and the nation, just as in our own day the greatest of modern English poets accepted a similar title for similar reasons. The last summons came to him near the close of 1753 in the form of an affection of the lungs. When told of his danger, he said, It is enough for me to know that I have sought all my life long to be a useful citizen of my country. I will therefore die willingly, and all the more so because I perceive that my mental powers are likely to fail me. The end came January 28th, 1754, when he had entered upon his 70th year. His body lies in the church at Sorbe, beneath a marble sarcophagus placed there a quarter of a century after his death. The words just quoted strike the prevailing note of Holberg's character in their unaffected simplicity, revealing the inmost nature of the man. He was simple in his daily life and simple in his chosen forms of literary expression, abhorring parade in the one as he abhorred pedantry in the other. Few figures of the 18th century stand out in as clear a light, and none is more deserving of respect. Holberg founded no school in the narrow sense, but in the wider sense the whole spiritual life of modern Denmark is traceable to his impulse and indebted to his example. He was not unconscious of his high mission, and even in the lightest of his comedies we may detect the ethical undercurrent. Es blot til list, not merely for pleasure, has long been the motto of the Danish National Theatre, and it was in the spirit of that fine phrase that Holberg wrote not only Den danske Skueplads, but also the many books of history and allegory, of philosophy and criticism that occupied his long and industrious days. Denmark may well be proud that such a figure stands in the forefront of its intellectual life. William Payne. Note: it is difficult to give any adequate idea of Holberg's work by means of a few selections, but the attempt must be made. I have chosen 3 extracts from the comedies. The first, from Ulysses von Ithacia, illustrates the author's work in its most fantastic phase. The second, from Den politiske Kandestober, illustrates his power and his limitations as a delineator of character. The third, from Erasmus Montanus, develops the central situation of his most remarkable play, illustrating his insight, his humor, and his skill in the management of dialogue. To these dramatic scenes I have appended 2 of the most characteristic epistles as examples of his manner as an essayist in prose. All the translations are my own and made for the present occasion. W.M.P. End of section 43, read by Bryce Cries, Ohio. Section 44 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. Selected Scenes by Ludvig Holberg, Part 1. From Ulysses von Ithacia. Ulysses. Alas, Chilion, I have tried in every way to calm the wrath of Neptune, but prayers, offerings are all in vain. We have now wandered about for 20 years since the conquest of Troy from one place to another, until we have at last come to Kajania, where Queen Dido has promised us provision of ships for the pursuit of our journey. But alas, day after day goes by, and I fear that it will be longer than we think. For I am afraid of something I dare not think about. I am afraid, Chilion. Chilion. What is my lord afraid of? Ulysses. I am afraid that Dido has fallen in love with me. Chilion. Perhaps. Ulysses. Oh, unfortunate man that I am! If it is true, Chilion, we shall never get away from here. Chilion. Will my lord not take it ill if I ask him how old he was when he left home? Ulysses. I was in the flower of my age, not over 40. Chilion. Good. 40 years to begin with, then 10 years for the siege makes 50, then 20 years on the homeward bound journey makes 70. The great Dido must be a great lover of antiquities if she is so cold toward the many young men from whom she might choose, and falls in love with an aged and bearded man. Ulysses. Listen, Chilion, I don't want to hear any such arguments. You must have made a mistake in the reckoning. When you see a thing with your eyes, you mustn't doubt it. If you saw snow in midsummer, you shouldn't say, "It is not possible that this should be snow, for it is now summer." It should be enough for you to see the snow with your eyes. Chilion. I observe, my lord, that I must leave reason out of the question in the things that have happened to us. So I will no longer doubt, but rather think how we can get ourselves out of this fix. Ulysses. How shall we escape this impending disaster? Chilion. There is no other way but to steal away from the land in secret. Ulysses. You are right there, Chilion. I will go right away and talk the situation over with my faithful comrades. Stay here until I come back. Goes away. Chilion, alone. I wish I had a pinch of snuff so I could catch my breath, for my head is almost distracted. I am sure that when my lord comes back, he will say again that it is 10 years since he last spoke with me. We shall get to be 5,000 or 6,000 years old before we come home to our fatherland. For I notice that we do not keep pace with time, but that time runs away from us while we stand still. I have a piece of English cheese here that I brought from Ithaca 30 years ago, and it is still quite fresh. And not only does time run away from us, but the earth on which we stand. For many times when I light my pipe, we are in the eastern corner of the world, and before I've smoked it out, we find ourselves in the western corner. Ulysses returns. Ulysses. Oh heavens, is it possible that such things can be in nature? Chilion. What is up now, your worship? Ulysses. Alas, Chilion, I never could have imagined such a thing if I hadn't seen it with these my eyes. Chilion. What is it, my lord? Ulysses. O Dido, Dido, what ill have I done thee, that thou shouldst thus exercise thy magic arts upon my faithful comrades? Chilion. Are they bewitched? Ulysses. Listen, Chilion, to a marvelous tale, the like of which has not been known from Deucalion's flood to the present time, during the 4 weeks since I last spoke with you. Chilion. Is it only 4 weeks? I thought it was about 4 years. Ulysses. During the 4 weeks, I say, I have been planning with my comrades to journey away in secret. We were all ready to go on board when Dido got wind of it, and to prevent our departure, by magic, chained all my comrades into swine. Chilion. That cannot be possible, gracious lord. Aside. Because they were swine before. Ulysses. Alas, it is too true, Chilion. I thought my eyes deceived me, and I spoke to them. But their speech was transformed with their shape, and for an answer they grunted at me. Then I took flight for fear of likewise being turned into a hog. But there they come. I dare stay no longer. Departs weeping. Enter the comrades of Ulysses, crawling on their hands and feet and grunting. Chilion. Ha, 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 ha. The deuce take you all. I never saw the like in all my days. Swine. Ugh, 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 ugh. Chilion. Listen, you fellows, what the devil is bestride you? Swine. We are swine, little father. Ugh, 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 ugh. Chilion. The devil take me if you are swine. Swine. Ugh, 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 ugh. Chilion. Gets down on his hands and feet and begins to grunt. Ugh, 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 ugh. Listen, you fellows, are you sure you are swine? Swine. Ugh, 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 ugh. Chilion. Well, since you are swine, you shall have swine's food. Eat me up this filth that lies here. Swine. We are not hungry, little father. Ugh, 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 ugh. Chilion. Beating them with a whip. Go on, I tell you, eat it up, or I will cut your swinish backs into strips. Go on, go on. If you are swine, it is the right food for you. He flogs them roundly. The swine get up and become men again. Swine. As sure as you live, you shall pay us for these blows, my good Monsieur Wegner. Aren't you ashamed to spoil the whole story in this way? They run off. Chilion. I didn't spoil the story. I made them into two-legged hogs as they were before. But there comes my lord again. Ulysses. Alas, Chilion, have they all gone? Chilion. Yes, my lord, they have gone. They go on two legs now as they did before. Ulysses. Are they no longer swine? Chilion. I don't say that, far from it. But my leechcraft has gone so far to make them two-legged once more. Ulysses. O great son of Aesculapius, you deserve to have temples and altars erected in your honor. From what god or goddess did you learn such divine arts? Chilion. I lay down in the field for a while, and with bitter tears bewailing the misfortune of our people. While weeping I fell asleep, and there appeared to me Proserpina, the goddess of leechcraft, that's her name, isn't it? Who said to me, Chilion, I have heard thy tears and thy prayers. Get up and cut a branch from the first birch on your left hand. It is a sacred tree that no man has hitherto touched. As soon as you touch your countrymen with it, they shall rise up and walk on two legs as before. Which happened just as she said. Whether they are still swine or not, I don't say, but it is certain that they look as they used to, walk on two legs, and speak, for they abused me because I hit them too hard with the sacred rod. Ulysses. O Chilion, you have saved me. Let me embrace you. Chilion. Servitor. It would be a pleasure to me if my lord would also turn hog, so that I might have the satisfaction of curing him too. Ulysses. Listen, Chilion, there's not much time to waste. The ship is all ready. Let us go and gather our people together, that we may escape hastily and in silence. See, there comes Dido. We must run. From The Political Pewterer. Hermann von Bremen, a Hamburg pewterer, has become a dabbler in politics, and with the freedom of ignorance expresses his opinions concerning various affairs of state. He meets regularly with a number of his friends in what they call a collegium politicum for the discussion of political matters. The characters in this act are Hermann, his wife Geska, his fellow politicians, and his servant Heinrich. Hermann. Heinrich, get everything ready. Mugs and pipes on the table. That is right. Heinrich makes preparations. One comes in after another, and all take seats at the table. Hermann at the head. Hermann. Welcome, good man, all of you. Where did we leave off last? Richard the brushmaker. We were talking about the interests of Germany. Gert the furrier. That is so. I remember now. It will all come up at the next Reichstag. I wish I could be there for an hour. I would whisper something to the Elector of Mainz that he would thank me for. The good people do not know where the interest of Germany lies. When did one ever hear of an imperial city like Vienna without a fleet, or at least without galleys? They might keep a war fleet for the defense of the kingdom. There is the war tax and the war treasure. See how much wiser the Turk is. We can never learn to wage war better than he does. There are forests enough in Austria and Prague, if they were only used for ships and masts. If we had a fleet in Austria or Prague, then the Turk and the Frenchman would stop besieging Vienna, and we could go to Constantinople. But nobody thinks of such things. Sievert the inspector. No, not a mother's son of them. Our forefathers were a good deal wiser. It all depends upon circumstances. Germany is no bigger now than it was in the old days, when we not only defended ourselves well enough against our neighbors, but even seized large parts of France and besieged Paris by land and water. Franz the wigmaker. But Paris isn't a seaport. Sievert the inspector. Then I read my map very badly. I know how Paris lies. Here lies England right where my finger is. Here is the Channel, here is Bordeaux, and here is Paris. Franz the wigmaker. No, brother, here is Germany, close to France, which connects with Germany. Ergo, Paris cannot be a seaport. Sievert. Doesn't France have any sea coast? Franz. No, indeed. A Frenchman who has not traveled abroad doesn't know anything about ships and boats. Ask Master Hermann. Isn't it the way I say, Master Hermann? Hermann. I will soon settle the dispute. Heinrich, get us the map of Europe. The host. Here you have one, but it is in pieces. Herman. That doesn't matter. I know where Paris is well enough, but I want the map to convince the others. Do you see, Sievert? Here is Germany. Sievert. That is all right. I can tell it by the Danube, which lies here. As he points to the Danube, his elbow tips over a mug, and the beer runs over the map. The host. The Danube is flowing a little too fast. General laughter. Herman. Listen, good people, we talk too much about foreign affairs. Let us talk about Hamburg. There is plenty here to think about. I have often wondered how it happens that we have no settlements in India and have to buy our wares of others. This is a matter that the Burgermeister and his council ought to think about. Richard. Don't talk about Burgermeister and council. If we wait till they think about it, we shall have to wait a long while. Here in Hamburg, a Burgermeister gets credit only for restricting law-abiding citizens. Herman. What I mean, my good men, is that it is not yet too late, for why should not the King of India trade with us as well as with the Dutchmen, who have nothing to send him but cheese and butter, which generally spoils on the way? It is my opinion that we should do well to bring the matter before the council. How many of us are there here? Host. There are only 6 of us. I don't believe the other 6 are coming any more. Herman. There are enough of us. What is your opinion, host? Let us put it to a vote. Host. I am not wholly in favor of it, for such journeys bring a good many people here from town, and I pick up some skillings from them. Sievert. It is my opinion that we should think more of the city's welfare than of our own interests, and that Master Herman's plan is one of the finest that has ever been made. The more trade we have, the more the city must prosper. The more ships come hither, the better it will be for us small officials. Yet this is not the chief reason why I vote for the plan, and I recommend it wholly for sake of the city's needs and prosperity. Gert. I can't altogether agree with this plan, but propose rather settlements in Greenland and Davis Strait, for such trade would be much better and more useful for the city. Franz the Cutler. I see that Gert's vote has more to do with his own interests than with the good of the Republic, for Indian voyages bring less business to furriers than voyages to the north. For my part, I hold that the Indian trade is the most important of all, for in India you can often get from the savages, for a knife or a fork, or a pair of scissors, a lump of gold that weighs as much. We must arrange it so that the plan we propose to the council shall not savor of self-interest, else we shall not make much headway with it. Richard. I am of Niels Scrivener's opinion. Herman. You vote like a brushmaker. Niels Scrivener isn't here. But what does that woman want? It is my wife, I declare. Enter Geska. Geska. Are you here, you idler? It would be quite as well if you did some work or looked after your people a little. We are losing one job after another by your neglect. Herman. Be quiet, wife. You may be the Frau Burgermeister before you know it. Do you suppose I am wasting my time? I am doing 10 times more work than all of you in the house. You only work with your hands, and I am working with my head. Geska. That's what all crazy folks do. They build air castles and split their heads with craziness and foolishness, imagining that they are doing something important when it amounts to nothing at all. Gert. If that was my wife, she shouldn't talk that way more than once. Herman. Gert, a politician mustn't mind it. 2 or 3 years ago I would have dressed my wife's back for such words, but since I began to dip into political books, I have learned to scorn talk like that. Qui nescit simulare, nescit regnare. Who knows not how to dissimulate, knows not how to reign. Says an old politician who was no fool. I think his name was Agrippa, or Albertus Magnus. It is a principle of politics all over the world that he who cannot bear a few sharp words from an ill-tempered and crazy woman isn't fit for any high place. Coolness is the greatest of virtues, and the jewel that best adorns rulers and authorities. So I hold that no one here in the city shall have a place in the council before he has given proof of his coolness, and let people see that he cannot be disturbed by abusive words, blows, and boxes on the ear. I am quick-tempered by nature, but I strive to overcome it by reflection. I have read in the preface of a book called Der politische Stockfisch, the political stockfish, that when a man is overcome with anger, he should count 20, and his anger will often pass away. Gert. It wouldn't help me if I counted 100. Herman. That means you are only fit for a humble place. Heinrich, give my wife a mug of beer at the little table. Geske. Hey, you rascal, do you think I came here to drink? Herman. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Now it is all over. Listen, mother, you mustn't talk so harshly to your husband. It is so very vulgar. Geske. Is it genteel to beg? Hasn't any wife cause to scold when she has for a husband an idler who neglects his family this way and lets his wife and children suffer? Herman. Heinrich, give her a glass of brandy. She is getting excited. Geske. Heinrich, box the ears of that rascal, my husband. Heinrich. You will have to do that yourself. I don't like the commission. Geske. Then I will do it myself. Boxes her husband's ears. Herman. 1, 2, 3, counts up to 20, then acts as if he were about to strike back, but begins to count 20 over again. If I hadn't been a politician, it would have been bad for you. Gert. If you can't manage your wife, I'll do it for you. To Geske. Get out of here. Geske flings herself out. Gert. I'll teach her to stay at home next time. If you have to be dragged about by the hair by your wife to be a politician, I shall never be one. Herman. Quis nescit simulare, nescit regener. It is easily said, but not so easy to practice. I confess it was a great shame my wife did me. I think I will run after her and beat her in the street. Yet, 1, 2, 3, counts to 20. It is all over. Let us talk about something else. Franz. Womenfolk have altogether too much to say here in Hamburg. Gert. That is true. I've often thought of making a proposal on the subject, but it is a serious thing to get into trouble with them. The proposal is a good one, however. Herman. What is your proposal? Gert. There are not many articles in it. First, I would not have the marriage contract lasting, but only for a certain number of years, so that if a man were not satisfied with his wife, he could make a new contract with another. Only both he and his companion should be bound to let each other know 3 months before moving day, which might be at Easter or Michaelmas. In case he was satisfied with her, the contract might be renewed. Believe me, if such a law were passed, there wouldn't be a single bad wife in Hamburg. They would all do their best to please their husbands and get the contract extended. Have any of you anything to say against this article? Franz, you smile in a knowing way. You must have something to say against it. Let us hear from you. Franz. Might not a wife sometimes find her account in getting separated from a husband who either treated her badly or was lazy, doing nothing but eat and drink without working to support his wife and children? Or she might take a liking for somebody else and lead her husband such a dance that he would let her go in spite of his resolve to keep her. I think that great misfortunes might spring from such a plan. There are ways to manage a wife after all. If everybody would, like you, Master Herman, count 20 every time his ears were boxed, we should have a lot of fine wives. Let us hear the other articles, Gert. Gert. Yes, you are likely to. You only want to make more fun of me. No plan can be so good that something will not be said against it. Herman. Let us talk about something else. Anybody who heard us would think we met to discuss the marriage relation. I was thinking last night, when I could not sleep, how the government of Hamburg might be changed so as to shut out a few families who seem born to be burgomeisters and councillors, and bring back full freedom to the city. I was thinking that we might choose our burgomeisters, now from one trade, now from another, so that all citizens could share in the government and all kinds of business prosper. For example, when a goldsmith became burgomeister, he would look after the goldsmith's interests, a tailor after the tailors, a pewterer after the pewterers, and nobody should be burgomeister more than a month, so that no trade should prosper more than another. If the government were arranged that way, we might be a truly free people. All. Your plan is a fine one, Master Hermann. You talk like a Solomon. Franz the cutler. The plan is good enough, but... Gert the furrier. You are always coming in with your buts. I believe your father or mother was a Mennonite. Hermann. Let him say what he means. What do you want to say? What do you mean by your but? Franz. I was wondering whether it wouldn't be hard sometimes to find a good burgomeister in every trade. Master Hermann is good enough, for he has studied, but after he is dead, where could we find another pewterer fit for such an office? For when the Republic is on its knees, it isn't as easy to mold it into another shape as it is to mold a plate or a mug when it is spoiled. Gert. Oh, rubbish. We can find plenty of good men among the working classes. Hermann. Listen, Franz, you are a young man yet, and so you can't see as far into things as we others, but I see that you have a good head and may amount to something in time. I will briefly prove to you from our own company that your reason is not a good one. There are 12 of us here, all working people, and each of us can see 100 mistakes that the council makes. Now just imagine one of us made burgomeister. He could correct the mistakes we have so often talked about and that the council is too blind to see. Would Hamburg City lose anything by such a burgomeister? If you good people think it would, I will give up my plan. All. You are quite right. Hermann. But now about our affairs. The time is going and we haven't read the papers yet. Heinrich, let us have the latest papers. Heinrich. Here are the latest papers. Hermann. Hand them to Richard, the brushmaker, who is our reader. Richard. They write from the head camp on the Rhine that recruits are expected. Hermann. Yes, they have written that a dozen times running. Skip the Rhine. I lose my temper altogether when that thing is talked about. What is the news from Italy? Richard. They write from Italy that Prince Eugene has broken up his camp, crossed the Po, and passed by all the fortresses to surprise the enemy's army, which thereupon retreated 4 miles in great haste. The Duke of Vendôme laid waste to his own country on the retreat. Hermann. Aha! His Highness is struck with blindness. We are undone. I wouldn't give 4 skillings for the whole army in Italy. Gert. I believe that the prince did right. That was always my plan. Didn't I say the other day, Franz, that he ought to do so? Franz. No, I can't remember that you did. Gert. I have said so 100 times, for how can the army lie and loiter there? The prince was all right. I will maintain it against anybody. Hermann. Heinrich, give me a glass of brandy. I must say, gentlemen, that things grew black before my eyes when I heard this news read. Your health, monsieur. Now I confess I call it a capital mistake to pass by the fortresses. Sievert. I would have done just the same if the army had been under my command. Franz. Yes, the next thing we shall see is that they will make generals out of inspectors. Sievert. You need not jeer. I could do as well as some other people. Gert. I think that Sievert is right, and that the prince did well to go straight at the enemy. Hermann. My good Gert, you know too much. You have a good deal to learn yet. Gert. I won't learn it from Franz, the cutler. They get into a sharp quarrel, talk in one another's faces, get up from their stools, storm and threaten. Hermann strikes the table and shouts, Quiet, quiet, gentlemen. Let us not talk about it any more. Everyone can have his own opinion. Listen, gentlemen, pay attention. Do you suppose the Duke of Vendôme retreated and laid waste the country because he was frightened? No, the fellow has read the Chronicle of Alexander Magnus, who acted just that way when Darius pursued him, and then won a victory as great as ours at Hochstadt. Heinrich. The postmaster's clock just struck 12. Hermann. Then we must all go. They continue the dispute on the way out. End of section 44, read by Bryce Cries, Ohio. Section 45 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. Selected Scenes by Ludvig Holberg, Part 2. From Erasmus Montanus. Rasmus Berg, the son of Jeppe and Nil, simple country folk, has been sent to the university for an education and returns to his home a pedantic prig. He has Latinized his name into Erasmus Montanus, and his attainments make a deep impression upon his parents. The third act introduces, besides these three, the betrothed of Erasmus, Lisbeth by name, her parents, Geronimus and Magdalene, Jesper Rigefoged, the bailiff, and Per Dane, the parish clerk. Nil. My son Montanus is staying away a long while. I wish he would come back before the bailiff goes, for he wants to talk with him, and is curious to ask him about this and that, such as, "Why, there he comes. Welcome back, my dear son. Geronimus must have been glad to see Mr. Son in good health after so long an absence." Montanus. I spoke neither with Geronimus nor his daughter on account of a fellow with whom I got into an argument. Nil. What sort of fellow is he? Perhaps it was the schoolmaster. Montanus. No, it was a stranger who leaves here today. I know him a little, although I never associated with him in Copenhagen. I lose my temper completely with people who imagine themselves the embodiment of all wisdom, and who are idiots. I will tell you, little mother, what it was all about. The fellow had been ordinarius opponens once or twice, and therein is his sole merita. But how did he perform in his partus? Mesere e hesitanter absc methodo. When Praesus once made a distinction inter rem e modum re, he asked, "Quid hoc est?" Wretch, you should have learned that antiquae in arenum descendis, quid hoc est, quae bruta. A fellow that ignores distinctions certinales and yet would dispute publica. Nil. Well, Mr. Son, must not take it too much to heart. I can tell from what you say that he must be a fool. Montanus. An ignoramus. Nil. Nothing is more certain. Montanus. An idiot. Nil. He cannot be anything else. Montanus. He publicly confused materiam cum forma. Nil. He ought to be punished for it. Montanus. And such a fellow thinks he can dispute. Nil. The devil he can. Montanus. Not to speak of the mistake he made in his premio when he said, "Levtissimi et doctissimi auditoris." Nil. What a fool he must be. Montanus. Think of putting lectissimus before doctissimus, when lectissimus is a predicate, as every beginner should know. Jeppe. But did my son get to talk with Geronimus? Montanus. No, for just as I was going in, I saw the fellow passing by the door, and since we knew each other, I went up to greet him, whereupon we got into a discussion about learned matters, and finally into a disputation, so that I had to postpone my visit. Jeppe. I am afraid that Monsieur Germanus will take it ill that my son went to his place and came away without seeing him. Montanus. I couldn't help it. When a man attacks philosophy, he attacks my honor. I am fond of Mademoiselle Lisbeth, but metaphysics and logica have their prior place in my affections. Nil. Oh, my dear son, what do I hear? Are you engaged to 2 other girls in Copenhagen? You may get into trouble with the courts. Montanus. You don't understand me. It is not meant that way. They are not girls, but 2 branches of science. Nil. That is different. But here comes the bailiff. Don't be angry any more. Montanus. I can't be angry with him because he is a simple and ignorant man with whom I cannot get into any argument. Enter Jesper. Jesper. Serviteur, monsieur. I congratulate you on your return. Montanus. Thank you, Mr. Bailiff. Jesper. I am very glad that we have so learned a man in town. It must have racked his brain a good deal before he got so far. I wish you joy too, Jeppy Berg. Your son makes you very happy in your old age. Jeppy. Yes, that is true. Jesper. Now listen, my dear Monsieur Erasmus. I want to ask you about something. Montanus. My name is Montanus. Jesper, aside to Jeppy. Montanus? Is that Latin for Rasmus? Jeppy. Yes, it must be. Jesper. Listen, my dear Monsieur Montanus Berg. I have heard said that learned folks have singular ideas. Is it true that in Copenhagen they think the earth is round? Here in the country no one will believe it. For how can it be, since the earth seems quite flat? Montanus. That is because the earth is so big that we do not notice its roundness. Jesper. Yes, that is true. The earth is big. It is almost half as big as the world. But listen, monsieur, how many stars would it take to make a moon? Montanus. A moon? The moon is to a star about as Pebbling Lake is to the whole of Sjælland. Jesper. Ha, 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 ha. Learned people are never quite right in their heads. I have even heard people say that the earth runs and the sun stands still. Monsieur doesn't believe that too. Montanus. No reasonable man any longer doubts it. Jesper. Ha, ha, ha. If the earth ran, we should all fall over and break our necks. Montanus. Cannot a ship sail with you without breaking your neck? Jesper. But you say the earth goes round. If a ship turned over, wouldn't the people fall out into the sea? Montanus. I will explain it more clearly if you will only be patient. Jesper. I don't want to hear about it. I should have to be crazy to believe such stuff. The earth turns round without our all falling into the gulf and going to the devil. Ha, ha, ha. But my dear Monsieur Berg, how does it happen that the moon is sometimes so little and sometimes so big? Montanus. If I were to tell you, you wouldn't believe it. Jesper. But just be good enough to tell me. Montanus. It is because when the moon is grown to full size, they cut off little pieces to make stars of. Jesper. That is very curious, I declare. I didn't know that before. If they didn't cut off the little pieces, it might grow too big and be as broad as Sjælland. Nature rules things very wisely, but why doesn't the moon warm us like the sun, since it is quite as big? Montanus. It is because the moon gives no light, but is made of the same dark matter as the earth and gets its light from the sun. Jesper. Ha, 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 ha. Let us talk about something else. Those things are disturbing enough to make a man's head turn Catholic. Enter Père Dane. Jeppy. Welcome, Père. Good people come where good people are. Here you see my son who has just come home. Père. Welcome here, Monsieur Erasmus Berg. Montanus. In Copenhagen I am usually called Montanus. I beg that you will address me by that name. Père. All right, it amounts to about the same thing. How are affairs in Copenhagen? Did many graduate this year? Montanus. As many as usual. Per. Were there some rejected this year? Montanus. 2 or 3, conditionaliter. Per. Who is imprimatur this year? Montanus. What do you mean? Per. I mean, who is imprimatur in verses and books that are printed? Montanus. Is that supposed to be Latin? Per. It was good Latin in my time. Montanus. If it was good Latin then, it must be now, but it was never Latin in the sense you give to it. Per. Good Latin it is all the same. Montanus. Is that a nomen or a verbum? Per. It is a nomen. Jesper. That's right, Per. Stick to it. Montanus. Cujus declinationis is imprimatur then. Per. All the words there are belong to 8 classes, which are nomen, pronomen, verbum, principium, conjugatio, declinatio, interjectio. Jesper. Hear, hear, listen to Per when he talks offhand. That is right, press him hard. Montanus. He doesn't answer what I ask him. What is imprimatur in genitivo? Per. Nominativus alla, genitivus alla, dativus allo, vocavitas allo, ablativus alla. Jesper. There, Monsieur Montanus. We have people here in the country, too. Per. I should say so. In my time, the fellows that matriculated were of a different sort from nowadays. They were fellows that got shaved twice a week and could scandere all sorts of verse. Montanus. That is a great thing to boast of. Anybody can do that now in the second lesson. Fellows now graduate from the schools of Copenhagen who can make Hebrew and Chaldaic verses. Per. Then they can't know much Latin. Montanus. Latin? If you were to go to school now, they would put you in the booby class. Jesper. Don't say that, Montanus. I know that the clerk is a deeply studied man. I have heard the tax collector and the district judge say so. Montanus. Perhaps they know no more Latin than he does. Jesper. But I can hear that he speaks up stoutly for himself. Montanus. He doesn't answer the questions I ask him. E qua schola dismissus es, me domini? Per. Adjectivium et substantivium genera numero et casio convenient. Jesper. He gives him full measure of faith. Come, Per, we'll have a glass of brandy together. Montanus. If Mr. Bailiff knew what these answers meant, he would split his sides laughing. I ask him from what school he graduated, and he answers with a lot of rubbish that has nothing to do with the question. Per. Tunc tua re agitur, peris cum proximus ardet. Jesper. Well, now he wants to go on. Just answer that. Montanus. I cannot answer it. It is more nonsense. Let us talk Danish together so that the others can understand, and you will soon find out what sort of fellow he is. Nil weeps. Jesper. What are you weeping for, mother? Nil. It hurts me so to have my son beaten in Latin. Jesper. Well, mother, that is no wonder. Per is so much older than he is. It is no wonder. Let them talk Danish now so we can all understand. Per. Very well. I am ready for whichever he chooses. We will ask each other a few questions. For example, who was it that cried so loud that he was heard all over the world? Montanus. I know of no one who can cry louder than donkeys and parish clerks. Per. Nonsense. Can you hear them all over the world? It was an ass in the ark because the whole world was in the ark. Jesper. Ha, ha, ha. So it was. Ha, ha, ha. Per Dane has got a cunning head on his shoulders. Per. Who killed a quarter of mankind? Montanus. I do not answer such coarse questions. Pair. It was Cain who killed his brother Abel. Montanus. Prove that there were not more than 4 human beings in the world. Pair. Prove that there were more. Montanus. I am not forced to, for affirmante incumbit probatio. Do you understand that? Pair. Certainly. Omnia conando docilis salertia vincit. Do you understand that? Montanus. I am very foolish to stay here in disputation with a booby. You would dispute and know neither Latin nor Danish, still less what logica is. Let us hear, quid est logica? Pair. Post melastron senectudum nos habebat humus. Montanus. Will the rascal make fun of me? Grabs him by the hair, they struggle. The clerk escapes, crying, Booby, booby. All go out except the bailiff. Enter Geronimus. Geronimus. Your servant, Mr. Bailiff. So I find you here. I came to see my future son-in-law, Rasmus Berg. Jesper. He will be here right away. Pity you didn't come half an hour sooner. You might have heard him argue with the clerk. Geronimus. How did it come out? Jesper. Père Dane, deuce take him, is slyer than I thought. I see that he has forgotten neither his Latin nor his Hebrew. Geronimus. I can believe that, for he never knew much of them. Jesper. Don't say that, Monsieur Geronimus. He has got a deuce of a mouth on him. It is really a pleasure to hear the man talk Latin. Geronimus. That is more than I supposed he could do. But how does my son-in-law look? Jesper. He looks dreadfully learned. You would hardly know him again. He has got another name, too. Geronimus. Another name? What's his name now? Jesper. He calls himself Montanus, which is the same as Rasmus in Latin. Geronimus. Oh, fie! That is abominable. I have known many who have thus changed their Christian names, and they never did well in the world. I knew one a few years ago who was christened Peer, and who, when he amounted to something, sought to change his stamp and had himself called Peter. But this Peter cost him dear, for he broke his leg and died in great wretchedness. Our Lord does not like such things, Mr. Bailiff. Jesper. I don't care what sort of name he takes, but I don't like to have him believe in such strange opinions. Geronimus. What opinions has he got? Jesper. They are frightful. The hair stands up on my head when I think of them. I don't remember all that I heard, but I know that he said, for one thing, that the earth was round. What do you think of that, Monsieur Geronimus? It is nothing less than upsetting all religion and leading people away from their faith. A heathen cannot be worse. Geronimus. He must have said it in jest. Jesper. It is dreadful to make such jests. See, there he comes. Enter Montanus. Montanus. Welcome, dear father-in-law. I am glad to see you in good health. Geronimus. People of my age cannot expect to have remarkable health. Montanus. You look thoroughly well. Geronimus. Do you think so? Montanus. How is Mademoiselle Lisbeth? Geronimus. Well enough. Montanus. Why, what is the matter that you greet me so coldly, dear father-in-law? Geronimus. I have good cause to. Montanus. What wrong have I done? Geronimus. I have been told that you have peculiar opinions. People must think you are crazy or Catholic in your head, for how can a reasonable man have the rashness to say that the earth is round? Montanus. Of course it is round. I must say what is true. Geronimus. It is the devil's own truth. Such notions must come from the father of lies. I am sure that there is not one man in this town who would not condemn such an opinion. Ask the bailiff, who is a reasonable man, if he doesn't agree with me. Jesper. It is all the same to me whether it is round or long, but I must believe my eyes, and they tell me the earth is as flat as a pancake. Montanus. It is all the same to me what the bailiff or anybody else in this town thinks about it, for I know the earth is round. Geronimus. It isn't round. I believe you are crazy. You have eyes in your head like other men. Montanus. It is well known, my dear father-in-law, that there are people right under us with feet pointed toward ours. Jesper. Ha 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 ha. Geronimus. You may well laugh, for he has a screw loose in his head. Just try once to get up under the ceiling and turn your head down, and then see what will come of it. Montanus. That is quite another matter, father-in-law. Geronimus. I won't be your father-in-law any more. I think more of my daughter than to throw her away on you. Montanus. Your daughter is as dear to me as my own soul, in truth, but you cannot expect me, for her sake, to renounce philosophy and send my intelligence into exile. Geronimus. Yes, yes, I hear you have got some other woman in your head. You may keep your Lucy or Sophie. I shall not force my daughter upon you. Montanus. You misunderstand me. Philosophy is only a branch of science, and it has opened my eyes in this matter as in others. Geronimus. It has rather blinded both eyes and understanding. How can you show such a thing as that? Montanus. It is not necessary to prove it. Educated persons no longer doubt it. Jesper. Père Dane would never admit that. Montanus. Père Dane? He is a nice fellow. I am foolish to stand here and talk philosophy with you, but to please Monsieur Geronimus, I will give you two proofs. First, that we get from travelers who, when they get several thousand miles away from us, have daylight when we have night, see other stars and another sky. Geronimus. Are you crazy that you say that there is more than one heaven and earth? Jesper. Yes, Monsieur Geronimus, there are 12 heavens, one above the other, until you come to the crystal heaven. He is right as to that. Montanus. O quanta tenebra. Geronimus. I went to Kiel 16 times when I was young, but as true as I am an honest man, I never saw any other sky than the one we have here. Montanus. You would have to travel 16 times as far, Domine Geronim, before you could see it, because... Geronimus. Stop talking such nonsense. It doesn't lead to anything. Let us hear the other proof. Montanus. The other proof is from eclipses of the sun and moon. Jesper. Just listen to that. Now he is really crazy. Montanus. What do you suppose an eclipse is? Jesper. Eclipses are signs set upon the sun and moon to show when some misfortune is to happen on earth. I can prove that by my own experience. When my wife was sick 3 years ago, and when my daughter Gertrude died, both times there were eclipses before. Montanus. Such nonsense will drive me crazy. Geronimus. The bailiff is right, for there is never an eclipse that does not mean something. When the last one occurred, everything seemed to be going well, but not for long. Only 2 weeks afterwards, we got news from Copenhagen that 6 students had failed at once, and 2 of them were dean's sons. If you don't hear of something bad in one place after such an eclipse, you are sure to in another. Montanus. That is certain enough, for no day passes without bringing misfortune in some part of the world. As for the people you speak about, they should not put it off on the eclipse, for if they had studied harder, they would have got through. Geronimus. What is an eclipse of the moon, then? Montanus. It is nothing but the earth's shadow, which deprives the moon of sunlight, and since the shadow is round, we can see that the earth likewise is round. It is all perfectly natural, for we can calculate eclipses, and therefore it is foolishness to say that they are signs of coming misfortune. Geronimus. Ah, Mr. Bailiff, I feel sick. It was an unhappy hour when your parents let you study. Jesper. Yes, he is pretty near to becoming an atheist. I must set Payne at him again. There is a man who can talk to some purpose. He shall prove to you, either in Latin or Greek as you like, that the earth, thank God, is as flat as my hand. But there comes Madame Geronimus with her daughter. Enter Magdalene and Lisbeth. Magdalene. Oh, my dear son-in-law, it is a joy to see you back again in good health. Lisbeth. Oh, my love, let me embrace you. Geronimus. Softly, softly, my child, not so fast. Lisbeth. May I not embrace my betrothed, whom I have not seen for years? Geronimus. Keep away from him, I tell you, or you will get beaten. Lisbeth, weeping. I know that we were publicly betrothed. Geronimus. That is true enough, but a difficulty has since arisen. Lisbeth weeps. Geronimus. You shall know, my child, that when he became engaged to you, he was a well-behaved man and a good Christian. But now he is a heretic and a fanatic who deserves to be put into the litany rather than into relationship with us. Lisbeth. Is that all, Father? We can settle that easily enough. Geronimus. Keep away from him, I say. Magdalene. What does this mean, Mr. Bailiff? Jesper. It is bad enough, madame. He brings false learning into the town, says that the earth is round, and things of that sort that I blush to mention. Geronimus. Don't you pity the good old parents who have spent so much money on him? Magdalene. Aye, is that all? If he loves our daughter, he will give up his notion and say that the earth is flat for her sake. Lisbeth. Ah, my love, say for my sake that it is flat. Montanus. I cannot oblige you so long as my reason has left me. I cannot give the earth any other shape than it has by nature. I will say and do all that is possible for your sake, but I cannot oblige you in this. For should my fellow students come to know that I had made such a statement, I should be scorned and held for a fool. Besides, we learned men never take back what we have said, but defend it to the last drop of our ink bottle. Magdalene. Listen, husband, this does not seem to me important enough to make us break off the match. Geronimus. And I say that if they were already married, I would have them divorced on account of it. Magdalene. I think I've got something to say about it, for if she is your daughter, she is mine too. Lisbeth, weeping. Oh, my dear, say that it is flat. Montanus. That I cannot. Geronimus. Listen, wife, you must know that I am the man of the house, and that I am her father. Magdalene. You must know also that I am the woman of the house, and that I am her mother. Geronimus. What I mean is that a father is of more account than a mother. Magdalene. And I say that he isn't, for no one can doubt that I am her mother, while you— I won't say any more, or I shall get excited. Lisbeth, weeping. Oh, my love, can't you say for my sake that it is flat? Montanus. I cannot, my pet. Nam contra naturem est. Geronimus. What do you mean by that, wife? Am I not her father as you are her mother? Listen, Lisbeth, am I not your father? Lisbeth. I think you must be, for my mother says so. I think you are my father, but I know she is my mother. Geronimus. What do you think of all this nonsense, Mr. Bailiff? Jesper. I can't say that mademoiselle is wrong, because— Geronimus. That's enough. Come, let us go. Be quite sure, my good Rasmus Berg, that you shall never get my daughter as long as you persist in your errors. Lisbeth, weeping. Oh, my love, say that it is flat. Geronimus. Out of the door. The visitors all depart. End of section 45, read by Bryce Cries, Ohio.
Section 46 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sonia. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18. Selections from the Epistles by Ludvig Holberg. A Defense of the Devil, from the Epistles. Our last conversation was about apologetic or defensive writings, which I confessed I could not endure, partly because an honest man and a good book need no apology, partly because it is possible to write in defense of anything, even of the devil. You laughed at my words, and replied that the latter task might prove somewhat difficult. I retorted that it would be no more difficult than to frame the defense that is made for the ass, wherein this beast is credited with various heroic qualities. In order to show that the thing may be done, I will briefly set forth what an apologist willing to trouble himself in such a cause may find to say in defense of the devil. I will say nothing of his capacity and intelligence, for all, including his greatest enemies, are agreed that a person who bears 6,000 years on his shoulders, and who has lived twice as long as the shoemaker of Jerusalem, must possess more learning and wisdom than the 7 wise men of Greece, perhaps more than all the professors on earth, if they were made into one. Nor will it be urged that he is falling into the childishness of age, a thing that cannot be asserted without médisance, since the most learned theologians, who have made a thorough study of the man's character, and know him to a nicety, are quite sure that he is in full vigour, so that age cannot have bitten him much, if at all. Similarly, the learned men of the last century, who had the honour of talking with the shoemaker of Jerusalem, bore witness that this self-same shoemaker was still in full possession of his 5 senses, so that neither understanding nor memory was at fault, although he had wandered about the world for 1600 years. There can therefore be no dispute about the understanding and knowledge of the devil, which cannot be other than vast, when we take his great age into consideration, and this is the reason why the Norse peasants bestow upon him the venerable title of Old Eric. But let us examine the evil characteristics that are ascribed to him. The devil is frequently said to go about plunging men into misfortune and leading souls astray. But since he has plainly, and by manifesto, so to speak, declared war upon the human race, he is more excusable than many men who under the guise of friendship mislead their neighbours, who make peaceful compacts only to break them, and who call God to witness the uprightness of their hearts that are yet full of hatred, enmity, and predatory desire. Hence it is said that we can guard ourselves against the devil, but not against men. That he should seek to lead souls astray is nothing more than that he should be desirous of strengthening his power, and showing that he is an alert politician, statesman, and economist. In the matter of pacts and contracts, his dealings are far more honourable than those of most men, for although the latter make agreements straightway to break them, and have thus brought themselves into so ill credit that none will contract with them, save under protection of a guarantee, experience, on the other hand, teaches us that the devil fulfills his agreements to the letter, performs exactly his promises to the contracting party, and seizes upon no one before the stipulated time is out. As we may see from the history of Dr. Faustus and other worthy men, whom by virtue of executed contracts he has instructed in arts, learning, and statesmanship, or aided with great cash subsidies, and demanded no payment for the work until the time of expiry, the term and the hour came to hand. Among all the harsh things that are said of the devil, we hear no one accuse him of failing to perform his contracts, or even of cheating anybody with false coin or false wares, as great numbers of our merchants and writers do, the former by giving false names to their wares, the latter by attaching false titles to their writings, for which they ask payment in advance, while the devil, for his part, carries out his agreements, neither giving nor exacting any advance payment. For that reason, we never hear of anyone who has contracted with the devil exacting any guarantee, which is indisputable evidence that he keeps his agreements honestly. It may be objected to this that the uprightness shown by the devil in his pacts and contracts does not proceed from honesty but from self-interest, since thereby he supports himself, and entices many to contract with him. But do you suppose our so-called upright merchants in all their dealings are honest merely for the sake of being honest? May not the rectitude of their conduct spring from the same source? It is said that when two things are one, they are yet not one, for what we call a virtue in the merchant is depicted as a vice in the devil. Since then the devil has thus come into ill repute, we ascribe to his influence adultery, murder, theft, and all evil doings. I do not go so far in this matter as wholly to acquit him, but I venture to say that the charges ordinarily brought against him have a bad effect, and are not well based. Their effect is bad, because they persuade sinners to put their guilt off their own shoulders and use the devil as a shield for their misdoings. They are ill based, because the corrupt flesh and blood of men are sufficient, without any cooperation, to drive them to sin. Further, the devil is said to prowl about at night for the disturbance of mankind. The conception one is bound to have of a cunning and evil spirit has prevented me from sharing the opinion of the learned in this matter, partly because I find the thing improbable, unless people admit, as no one does, that he is in his second childhood, and partly because such spooking would oppose his own interests. But since I have been blamed for this opinion, I have renounced it, and now confess with the orthodox that it really is the devil who spooks by night in churchyards, houses, and nurseries. But in that case it follows that people are made God-fearing, and that the devil by this practice of spooking shows himself a friend rather than an enemy of mankind, so that he should be praised rather than blamed for the habit. His function as the judge and executioner of the lost should not be a blot upon his name and good report, for that is a necessity, and just as no city can dispense with an executioner, so mankind in general cannot get along without such a general officer to execute the judgments pronounced upon the guilty. The office in itself is not only necessary, but even honorable, as we may see from the ancient Greeks, who made two men of importance, Minos and Rhadamanthus, the executioners in Pluto's realm. We see from all these considerations that the devil is not as black as he is painted, that on the contrary, he has many good qualities, so that it is far less difficult to defend him than many men upon whose record there is no blot. It is quite to be believed, as many unpartisan men have observed, that we go too far in such judgments, and that if the learned and unpartisan theologian Gottfried Arnold, who was the advocate for many despised persons, had lived longer, he would have undertaken the defense of this notorious spirit, which we see is not a task so difficult, but that with the help of a good rhetorica it may be given some color of success. That the devil tempts men cannot well be disputed, but since experience shows that these alleged temptations may often be driven off by means of powders and drops, we see that even this accusation is often ill-founded, unless one is willing to contend that the devil himself may be driven off by crab's eyes and purgative pills, which would be to hold the enemy too cheap. See, here you have the devil's defense, written in haste. You may see from it what a skilful disputator might accomplish who should undertake to defend his case ex cathedra, or an advocate who had won a reputation for turning evil to good. Logica and rhetorica are two of the chief sciences. It was with the aid of logica that Zeno Eliatis proved that nothing in the world had motion. It was by the same aid that Erasmus Montanus distinctly showed Peder Deng to be a cock, and that to beat one's parents is a meritorious act. But to speak seriously, I beg that you will not show this letter to anybody, and particularly not to Herr Niels or Peder Deng, for they might take it all literally, and find in it the text for a sermon, and it might fare with me as with a certain man who was dubbed cardinal by the jovial papal collegio, organized in this town a few years ago. After his death a number of letters were found, giving him the title of Cardinal Orsini, and this the authorities took literally, discussing with their colleagues whether the deceased might be permitted burial in Christian earth. I remain, etc. The Society of Women, from the Epistles. You express surprise that I, who am advanced in years, and have always been devoted to study, should take more satisfaction in the society of women than of men. But you will be still more surprised when I say that it is precisely on account of my studies that I seek such society. To make sense out of this paradox, you must know that when at home I am usually occupied with some sort of work that racks my brains, and go out only for the purpose of giving my head a necessary rest. Such rest may be comfortably enjoyed in the drawing-rooms of women, where there is heard as a rule only commonplace talk that calls for no meditation. And that is the reason why, when I have given myself a headache with study, I would rather go to see Madame N. than anybody else, for she will tell me nothing except what she has eaten during the day, or how many eggs her hens have laid that week, or other things of that sort, which neither rack the brains nor strain the sinews of the head. In men's company, on the other hand, there are discourses that make the head swim. There is usually talk of judicial proceedings and affairs of state, which are useful enough matters, and even agreeable at the proper time, but not when one seeks society for the sole purpose of recreating the mind and giving the brain a rest. People begin, as soon as the first greetings are over, by explaining to me some matter that has that day been decided in court or council chamber, in order to get my opinion of it, or they entangle my wits in affairs of state, for which any new regulation or bit of fresh news affords a pretext, which is like proposing a game of chess to a man just out of his library, thus setting him to the work of study again. This is the reason why Englishmen, among other matters that give evidence of their discernment, do not like games that require meditation. Their backgame, for example, is not nearly so tedious as our forkering. The same can be said of their sports in the shape of cox and bulldog fights, and others of the sort. Le jeu d'échecs, the French say, n'est pas assez jeu. That is, chess and other games of that sort are not amusement, but study. Hence they are good for people who have nothing serious to do, and whose brains are in danger of rusting from idleness, but not for busy folks who seek for recreation in games and society. We find in consequence that people of affairs set apart certain hours of the day in which they wish to hear nothing but innocent gossip, and it is related that for this reason Richelieu spent 1 hour of each day in such company, for he could not find his account in taking up metaphysical discussions when he had just left his cabinet all tired out. It was also for this reason that Socrates played with his children now and then. Another reason why I prefer to seek the society of women is this: when I come into men's society, I am offered either a glass of wine or a pipe of tobacco, which is by no means to my taste. In women's society, on the other hand, I get tea, coffee, and nonsensical chatter, which best suits my idle hours. Here you have the reasons for my conduct in this matter. I remain, etc. End of section 46. End of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 18, by Various.